Hello everyone, I'm the DreamTeller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the forest. I had been hiking for hours, pushing deeper into the wilderness than I'd ever gone before. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I knew I needed to find shelter soon. That's when I saw it. A small cabin nestled among the pines, barely visible in the fading light. Little did I know, my discovery would plunge me into a night of terror I'd never forget. I approached the cabin cautiously, my backpack heavy on my shoulders after a long day of trekking. The wooden structure looked weathered but stable, its windows dark and lifeless. Perfect for a night's rest, I thought. I couldn't have been more wrong. As I got closer, I noticed there were no signs of recent habitation. No smoke from the chimney, no lights, no sounds of life. Just an overwhelming silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I climbed the creaky steps to the porch, my hand hesitating for a moment before I knocked on the door. The hollow sound echoed through the trees, startling a few birds into flight. No answer. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a musty interior. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I stepped inside. It was a simple one-room cabin, with a small kitchenette in one corner and a rustic bed frame against the far wall. A thick layer of dust covered everything, confirming my suspicion that no one had been here in a long time. I set my backpack down and began to settle in for the night. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I was grateful for the shelter, despite its eerie emptiness. I gathered some wood from a pile near the fireplace, and soon had a small fire crackling, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I sat by the fire, warming my hands and eating a protein bar from my pack, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest outside seemed too quiet, the darkness too thick. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place playing tricks on my mind. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound outside. My heart raced as I sat up, straining my ears. There it was again, a twig snapping, followed by what sounded like hushed whispers. I held my breath, hoping it was just some nocturnal animals foraging. But then I saw it. A shadow passed by one of the windows, too large and deliberate to be an animal. I froze, my body rigid with fear. Another shadow followed, then another. They were moving silently, circling the cabin. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. Who were they? What did they want? I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as I swept it across the windows. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of a face peering in, pale, with wild eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. I stifled a scream and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my panic. The whispers outside grew more urgent, and I could hear footsteps on the porch. They knew I had seen them. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes fell on a rusted fireplace poker. I snatched it up, gripping it so tight my knuckles turned white. The door handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately. I backed into a corner, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. In the dim firelight, I could make out a man, tall and gaunt, with long, matted hair and clothes that hung in tatters from his frame. His eyes found mine, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. Well, he rasped, his voice like gravel. Looks like we have a guest. More figures filed in behind him, each as wild and unkempt as the first. I counted 5 of them, all men, all with the same feral look in their eyes. They spread out, blocking any path to the door. Please, I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll leave right now." The first man, clearly the leader, chuckled. It was a dry, humorless sound that sent chills down my spine. "Leave? Oh no, I'm afraid that's not an option. You see, you've stumbled into our home, and we don't take kindly to trespassers." I gripped the fireplace poker tighter, raising it in front of me. "Stay back," I warned, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I don't want any trouble." The leader's eyes narrowed, focusing on the poker in my hands. "Trouble? No, we don't want any trouble either. We just want to make sure you're comfortable. After all, you'll be staying with us for quite some time." The others laughed, a chilling sound that made my blood run cold. They began to close in, their intentions clear in their hungry eyes. I knew I had to act fast or I'd never leave this cabin alive. In a desperate move, I lunged forward, swinging the poker wildly. It connected with someone's arm, eliciting a howl of pain. Taking advantage of their momentary surprise, I sprinted for the door, shoving past them with all my might. I burst out onto the porch, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. Behind me, I could hear shouts of anger and the sound of pursuit. I didn't dare look back, just ran headlong into the forest, branches whipping at my face and arms. The forest was pitch black, my flashlight long forgotten in the cabin. I stumbled blindly, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. My lungs burned, and my legs ached. But terror drove me forward. The sounds of pursuit were ever present, sometimes fading slightly, only to grow louder again. I had no idea where I was going or how far I'd run. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the taste of blood filling my mouth as I bit my tongue. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain shooting through my ankle. Just then, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me backward. I screamed, thrashing wildly, but the grip was like iron. I was spun around, coming face to face with one of my pursuers. His breath was hot on my face, reeking of decay. "Thought you could run, did ya?" he snarled, his yellowed teeth bared in a grotesque grin. I didn't think, just reacted. I brought my knee up hard, connecting with his groin. He doubled over with a wheeze, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I took off again, my injured ankle protesting with every step. I could hear a stream nearby and made for it, hoping the water might help cover my tracks. I splashed through the icy water, the cold shocking my system, but clearing my head slightly. I followed the stream, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I spotted a steep embankment. With the last of my strength, I climbed up, using roots and rocks as handholds. At the top, I collapsed, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I lay there, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit, but all I could hear was the gentle burble of the stream and my own ragged breathing. Had I lost them? I didn't dare hope. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of my situation set in. I was lost in the wilderness, in the middle of the night, with no supplies and no idea which direction to go. And somewhere out there, those men were still looking for me. I had escaped the cabin, but I was far from safe. I forced myself to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ankle. I had to keep moving. I picked a direction and started walking, using the stars to try and maintain a straight course. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential pursuer. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, I finally heard what I'd been praying for, the distant rumble of traffic, civilization, safety. I quickened my pace, hope giving me a second wind. I burst out of the tree line onto the shoulder of a highway, nearly sobbing with relief. An early morning trucker, startled by my sudden appearance, screeched to a halt. I must have been a sight, clothes torn, face scratched, covered in dirt and blood. The trucker, a kind-faced man in his 50s, didn't ask questions. He just opened the passenger door and said, "Hop in, kid. Let's get you somewhere safe." As we drove away, I watched the forest recede in the side mirror. My ordeal was over, but I knew the memory of that night would haunt me for years to come. The wilderness held beauty, yes, but it also harbored darker things. Things that reminded us that in the depths of the forest, we are not always at the top of the food chain. The golden light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the canopy when I heard it. The harsh, mechanical roar that had no place in this pristine wilderness. My finger froze on the shutter of my camera, the rare bird I'd been tracking forgotten in an instant. Something was very wrong in my forest paradise, and I was about to stumble into a nightmare I never saw coming. I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade, spending months at a time in the most remote corners of the world. But this assignment was special, documenting the elusive wildlife of an untouched old-growth forest. For weeks, I'd been living out of my tent, rising before dawn and trekking deep into the woods, camera in hand. That morning started like any other. I'd woken in the pre-dawn darkness, made a quick breakfast over my camp stove, and set out in search of the perfect shot. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds greeting the new day, and I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation. What wonders would I capture through my lens today? But as I crested a small rise, that unnatural sound shattered the serenity. Curiosity overrode caution, and I found myself moving towards the noise, each step filled with a growing sense of dread. As I drew closer, the sound resolved itself into the unmistakable growl of chainsaws. My heart sank. This forest was supposed to be protected, untouched by human exploitation. What was going on? I crept forward, using the dense underbrush for cover. The trees began to thin, and suddenly I was on the edge of a clearing that shouldn't have existed. My eyes widened in horror at the scene before me. A group of men, maybe a dozen, were systematically felling the ancient trees. The forest giants that had stood for centuries were crashing to the ground, their fall echoing like thunder. Heavy machinery sat idle nearby, ready to haul away the precious timber. This was no sanctioned operation. There were no uniforms, no safety gear, just rough-looking men wielding chainsaws with practiced ease. I had stumbled upon an illegal logging operation, and my stomach churned at the destruction they were wreaking on this pristine ecosystem. Instinct took over, and I raised my camera. The long lens allowed me to zoom in on their faces, capturing clear images of the loggers and their equipment. Evidence, proof of their crimes against nature. I was so focused on documenting the scene that I didn't notice one of the men had stopped working. He was staring right at me, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Our gazes locked, and in that moment I knew I was in deep trouble. He shouted something to his companions, and suddenly all activity ceased. A dozen pairs of eyes turned in my direction, filled with anger and fear. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with none of my usual care for stealth. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the revving of engines. They were coming after me, and they had vehicles. My only advantage was my knowledge of the forest and the fact that much of the terrain was too dense for their trucks to navigate. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning and branches whipping at my face. The precious camera bounced against my chest, a reminder of why I couldn't let them catch me. Those photos were evidence of their crimes, and I had a feeling these men wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to keep their operations secret. The sound of engines grew closer, and I veered off the game trail I'd been following, plunging into a thicket of young trees. The branches clawed at me, but I pushed through, ignoring the sting of scratches on my arms and face. I emerged on the other side, finding myself at the top of a steep ravine. The drop was daunting, but I could hear my pursuers closing in. Taking a deep breath, I began to half run, half slide down the incline, using saplings and roots to control my descent. Halfway down, my foot slipped on a patch of loose earth. I fell, tumbling head over heels, unable to stop my momentum. Pain exploded through my body as I hit rocks and branches, finally coming to a stop at the bottom of the ravine. I lay there for a moment, dazed and aching, the taste of blood in my mouth. The sound of voices from above snapped me back to reality. I couldn't afford to rest. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I forced myself to my feet. My left ankle protested, threatening to buckle rouse, but I had no choice. I had to keep moving. I limped along the bottom of the ravine, using the stream that ran through it to mask my trail. The cold water numbed my throbbing ankle, providing some small relief. But I knew I couldn't stay in the open. I needed to find a place to hide, to catch my breath and figure out my next move. A fallen tree, its massive root system creating a natural cave, caught my eye. It wasn't much, but it was the best option I had. I crawled into the space, pulling leaves and branches over the opening to conceal myself. Huddled in my makeshift hiding spot, I finally had a moment to assess my situation. My body was a map of cuts and bruises, my ankle swollen and painful. The camera, miraculously, seemed unharmed. I checked the memory card, relieved to find the incriminating photos intact. From somewhere above, I heard the rumble of engines and shouted orders. They were searching methodically, and it was only a matter of time before they made their way down to the ravine. I needed a plan. My phone, I suddenly remembered. I fished it out of my pocket, my heart sinking as I saw the cracked screen. Still, it powered on. No signal, of course. I was too deep in the wilderness. But if I could get to higher ground, maybe I could call for help. I knew these woods better than my pursuers, having spent weeks exploring every nook and cranny. There was a fire tower about 5 miles to the east, overlooking the valley. If I could reach it, I might be able to get a signal and a defensible position. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to leave my hiding spot. The voices seemed to have moved off, but I couldn't be sure. I peeked out, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Seeing nothing, I crawled out and got to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ankle. I set off, moving as quietly as I could while still maintaining a decent pace. The forest, which had been a source of wonder and beauty for weeks, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every snapping twig made me flinch, every shadow potentially concealing a pursuer. As I walked, my mind raced. Who were these men? How long had they been operating here, destroying this protected land? The rangers who patrolled the area must be either incompetent or complicit. The thought made my blood boil. This forest was supposed to be a sanctuary, and instead, it was being pillaged. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat was stifling, and my water supply was running dangerously low. But I pushed on, driven by the need to expose what I had seen. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, I caught sight of the fire tower through the trees. It was an old structure, long abandoned by the Forest Service, but still standing tall above the canopy. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I was so focused on my goal that I almost missed the sound. An engine, somewhere behind me. They had found my trail. Panic gave me speed, and I sprinted the last 100 yards to the tower, ignoring the screaming pain in my ankle. The ladder was old and rusted, but it held my weight as I scrambled up. I reached the small room at the top, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. For the first time in hours, I felt a modicum of safety. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone. 1 bar of signal. It would have to do. I dialed 911, praying the call would go through. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. My name is Alex Reeves, I said, my voice hoarse. I'm a wildlife photographer, and I've witnessed an illegal logging operation in the Cascade River State Forest. They're after me. I'm in the old fire tower off Trail 17. Please, I need help. Stay calm, Mr. Reeves. We're dispatching rangers and state police to your location now. Can you stay on the line with me? Yes, I started to say, but the word died in my throat. Through the windows of the tower, I could see a cloud of dust rising from the forest road. They had found me. They're here, I whispered into the phone. Oh God, they're here. Mr. Reeves, help is on the way. Find a safe place to hide and stay quiet. Do not engage with them. I looked around the small room frantically. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. I was trapped. The sound of doors slamming echoed up from below, followed by angry shouts. I could hear them at the base of the tower, arguing about who would come up. Listen, I said urgently into the phone. If anything happens to me, there's a memory card in my camera with photos of the logging operation. It's evidence. Make sure it gets to the authorities. Mr. Reeves, stay with me. Help is coming. You're going to be okay. But as I heard the creak of someone climbing the ladder, I wasn't so sure. I clutched my camera to my chest, ready to fight with everything I had to protect the truth I had uncovered. The trap door began to open, and I braced myself for whatever came next. One way or another, this was going to end here, high above the forest I had come to love. And I swore to myself that no matter what happened, I would make sure the world knew what was happening in this supposed sanctuary. The door swung open, and I found myself face to face with my pursuers. In that moment, I realized that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the forest walk on two legs. The crackling of the campfire was suddenly drowned out by the roar of engines. I exchanged a worried glance with my wife, Sarah, as our kids huddled closer. This was supposed to be our perfect family getaway, but in an instant, our peaceful night turned into a parent's worst nightmare. We had been planning this camping trip for months, with two kids constantly glued to their devices and Sarah and I buried in work. We desperately needed to reconnect as a family. The promise of fresh air, starry nights, and no Wi-Fi seemed like the perfect recipe for family bonding. Our first 2 days had been idyllic. We hiked trails, told stories around the campfire, and marveled at the beauty of nature. Our daughter, Emma, even put down her phone long enough to learn how to fish, while our son, Jake, surprised us all with his knack for identifying bird calls. For the first time in ages, we felt like a real family again. But as we sat around the fire on our third night, roasting marshmallows and planning the next day's adventure, the distant rumble of engines shattered our tranquility. At first, I tried to brush it off. Probably just some late arrivals, I said, forcing a smile. But as the noise grew louder, the unease in my gut intensified. Suddenly, bright headlights cut through the darkness, temporarily blinding us. 3 large pickup trucks came to a screeching halt at the edge of our campsite, the engines cut off, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the slamming of car doors. "Stay close," I murmured to my family, standing up slowly. Sarah pulled the kids behind her, her eyes wide with fear. A group of men emerged from the trucks, their silhouettes backlit by the headlights. There were at least 6 of them, all burly and intimidating. The leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard, stepped forward. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice rough as gravel. "Looks like we've got ourselves some city folk enjoying our woods." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can we help you with something?" The man chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Oh, I think you can. See? These here woods. They're ours. And we don't take kindly to outsiders camping on our land." My mind raced. We had obtained all the necessary permits, followed every rule. This was public land, wasn't it? But looking at the menacing group before us, I realized that official regulations might not mean much out here. "There must be some misunderstanding," I said, taking a step forward. "We have permits. This is a designated campground." One of the other men spat on the ground. "Permits don't mean shit out here, city boy. This is our territory." I could feel the situation spiraling out of control. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened, and I could hear Emma whimpering softly behind me. The leader's eyes narrowed. "Here's what's going to happen. You're gonna pack up your fancy gear and get the hell out of our woods. Now. Please, Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling. We have children. It's the middle of the night. We can't just leave. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something, hesitation, maybe even guilt, in the leader's eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a cold determination. Not my problem, lady. You've got 10 minutes to clear out, or things are gonna get real unpleasant. The threat hung in the air, heavy and palpable. I looked at my family, Sarah's pale face, Emma's tears, Jake's wide, frightened eyes, and knew I had to get them out of there. Okay, I said, holding up my hands in a placating gesture. We'll leave. Just give us a few minutes to pack up. The leader nodded curtly. 10 minutes. Not a second more. As the men retreated to their trucks, we sprang into action. We had spent 2 days meticulously setting up our campsite, but now we threw everything haphazardly into bags in the car. Tent poles clattered, sleeping bags were stuffed unceremoniously into the trunk, and half-empty coolers were tossed in the back seat. All the while, I could feel the men's eyes on us, watching our every move. The weight of their gazes made my skin crawl, and I tried to position myself between them and my family as much as possible. As Sarah ushered the kids into the car, I did a final sweep of the campsite. In our haste, we had left behind Emma's favorite stuffed animal, a worn rabbit she'd had since she was a toddler. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the need to leave and the knowledge of how devastated Emma would be to lose her cherished toy. Making a split-second decision, I darted back to grab it. As I snatched up the stuffed rabbit, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I turned to find the leader looming over me, his face twisted in a sneer. "Time's up, city boy," he growled. I clutched the rabbit to my chest, my heart pounding. "We're leaving. Right now." But as I tried to step around him, he grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "Maybe we didn't make ourselves clear earlier. We don't want your kind here. Ever." I could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the dangerous glint in his eyes. This man wasn't just trying to scare us off. He genuinely saw us as a threat to whatever twisted version of territory he believed he controlled. "We won't come back," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fear coursing through me. "You have my word." He leaned in closer, his voice a menacing whisper. "Words ain't enough. Maybe we need to leave you with a reminder." I saw his fist clench, and in that moment, I truly believed he was going to hit me. But before he could, a shrill voice cut through the tension. "Daddy!" Emma had gotten out of the car and was running towards us, her face streaked with tears. The sight of his daughter seemed to snap the man out of his rage. He released my arm, taking a step back. I scooped Emma up, holding her close. "It's okay, sweetie. We're leaving now." As I carried her back to the car, I could feel the leader's eyes boring into my back. The message was clear. We had narrowly avoided something much worse. We peeled out of the campsite, gravel spraying from our tires. In the rearview mirror, I could see the men watching us go, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and lingering anger. For miles, we drove in tense silence, the only sound the quiet sobs of the kids in the back seat. Sarah's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing behind us, half expecting to see headlights in pursuit. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that we all seemed to collectively exhale. The immediate danger had passed, but the fear lingered. What just happened?" Jake asked, his voice small and confused. I turned in my seat to face my children, trying to find the right words to explain the ugliness we had just encountered. How do you tell your kids that sometimes people can be cruel and dangerous for no good reason? Sometimes, I began slowly, we meet people who are angry or scared, and they take it out on others. What those men did was wrong, but we're safe now. Emma clutched her recovered stuffed rabbit tightly. "Are they going to find us again?" "No, sweetheart," Sarah said firmly, meeting Emma's eyes in the rearview mirror. We're far away from them now, and we're not going back there. As we continued to drive through the night, heading home much earlier than planned, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly our idyllic family vacation had turned into a nightmare. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming and peaceful just hours ago, now felt sinister and threatening. We drove until the sun began to peek over the horizon, finally stopping at a busy truck stop for breakfast. As we sat in a brightly lit diner, surrounded by the comforting sounds of clinking dishes and murmured conversations, the events of the night began to feel almost surreal. Over plates of pancakes and cups of steaming coffee, we talked. We talked about fear and courage, about the importance of standing up for what's right while also knowing when to walk away. We talked about how sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones in stories, but the ones we encounter in real life. And slowly, as the warmth of the food and the safety of daylight seeped into our bones, we began to heal. The kids' eyes lost some of their fearful glaze, and Sarah's shoulders relaxed from their tense set. As we prepared to leave the diner and complete our journey home, I looked at my family, tired, a bit shaken but resilient. We had faced a terrifying situation together and come out the other side. "Next time," Jake said as we walked to the car, "can we just go to Disneyland?" The laughter that bubbled up was cathartic. Releasing the last of the night's tension, we piled into the car, ready to head home, our camping gear a jumbled mess in the back, but our family bond stronger than ever. The open road stretched before us, leading away from the darkness of the forest and towards the comfort of home. As we drove, I made a silent promise to myself and my family. We would not let one bad experience taint our love for nature and adventure. We would be more cautious, yes, but we would not let fear win. Our perfect family getaway hadn't gone as planned, but in facing adversity together, we had found something perhaps even more valuable. A deeper appreciation for each other and the knowledge that together, we could weather any storm. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the open zipper on my tent. I froze, my hand hovering over the flap, heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I always zipped it closed, a habit born from years of solo camping. But there it was, gaping open like a silent scream in the early morning light. I had come to these woods to escape the chaos of my life, to find some peace in the solitude of nature. 3 days of hiking, camping, and communing with the wilderness had done wonders for my stress levels, or at least, it had until this moment. Swallowing hard, I pushed the tent flap aside and peered in. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. My sleeping bag was still rumpled from where I'd crawled out of it at dawn. My backpack leaned against the far side, seemingly untouched. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed small discrepancies. My clothes, which I always folded neatly, were strewn about. The zipper on my pack was partially open. A chill ran down my spine as I realized someone had been in my tent while I was out on my morning hike. I'd only been gone for an hour, maybe less. Whoever it was couldn't be far. I stepped back, scanning the campsite with new eyes. The remains of last night's fire were cold, undisturbed. My cooking gear was still hanging from a nearby tree branch, exactly where I'd left it. But then I saw it, footprints in the soft earth near my tent, too large to be my own. My mind raced. Should I pack up and leave, call for help? But I was miles from any cell service, and the nearest ranger station was a day's hike away. I was well and truly alone. As I stood there, paralyzed with indecision, a twig snapped in the woods behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. The dense foliage revealed nothing, but I could feel it now. Eyes watching me from the shadows. "Hello?" I called out, hating how my voice quavered. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, heavy and oppressive. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if holding their breath along with me. I turned back to my tent, determined to grab my things and get out of there. But as I reached for my pack, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, pinned to my sleeping bag with my own hunting knife, was a note. With trembling fingers, I plucked it free. The message, scrawled in jagged handwriting, was brief but chilling. "I'm watching you." Panic surged through me. This wasn't just some random hiker who had stumbled upon my camp. This was deliberate. Someone was stalking me. I shoved the note into my pocket and grabbed my pack, not bothering to properly break down the tent. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made me flinch. I needed to get out of there, fast. As I shouldered my pack, movement caught my eye. There, half hidden behind a tree about 50 yards away, was a figure. I caught only a glimpse, a flash of dirty clothes, a matted beard, before it melted back into the shadows. That was all I needed to see. I took off running down the trail, my heavy pack bouncing painfully against my back. I had no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and that campsite as possible. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, the sound of my pounding footsteps and ragged breathing drowning out everything else. When I finally slowed, gasping for air, the forest around me was unfamiliar. In my panic, I'd veered off the main trail. Leaning against a tree, I tried to calm my racing heart and think rationally. I was lost, being stalked by some unknown person, and had limited supplies. The situation was bad, but panicking wouldn't help. I needed a plan. First things first, I needed to figure out where I was. I dug my map and compass out of my pack, grateful for once that I'd opted for old-school navigation over relying on my phone's GPS. As I tried to orient myself, a rustling in the underbrush nearby made me freeze. I held my breath, eyes darting around. Was it him? Had he followed me? The rustling grew closer, and I prepared to run again. But instead of my stalker, a deer emerged from the bushes. It regarded me with large, liquid eyes for a moment before bounding away. The encounter, brief as it was, helped clear my head. I wasn't helpless. I had survival skills. I had supplies, and most importantly, I had my wits. I could figure this out. According to my map, there was a fire tower about 5 miles to the east. If I could reach it, I might be able to call for help, or at least get a better view of my surroundings. It was as good a plan as any. I set off, moving as quietly as I could while still maintaining a brisk pace. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, searching for any sign that I was being followed. But the forest remained quiet, indifferent to my plight. As the day wore on, the weight of my pack and the stress of constantly looking over my shoulder began to take their toll. My shoulders ached, and a headache pounded behind my eyes. But I pushed on, driven by the need to reach safety. It was late afternoon when I finally spotted the fire tower through the trees. The sight of the metal structure rising above the canopy filled me with relief so profound I could have wept. I quickened my pace, eager to reach this beacon of civilization. But as I approached the base of the tower, that relief turned to ash in my mouth. The lower portion of the ladder had been removed, leaving a good 10-foot gap between the ground and the first rung. Someone had deliberately made this tower inaccessible. I slumped to the ground, despair washing over me. My one hope of safety, of contacting the outside world, was literally out of reach. As the reality of my situation sank in, I buried my face in my hands, finally allowing myself a moment of weakness. A noise snapped me back to alertness, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. I scrambled to my feet, looking around wildly for the source. And there he was, emerging from the trees like some nightmarish forest spirit. He was a large man, his frame made bulky by layers of tattered clothing. A wild beard obscured most of his face, but his eyes were sharp and alert as they fixed on me. In his hand, he clutched a crude club fashioned from a tree branch. "Nowhere left to run," he said, his voice rough from disuse. I backed away, my mind racing. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I haven't done anything to you." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're trespassing. These are my woods. This is public land, I argued, though I knew reasoning with him was probably futile. You can't just claim it. His eyes narrowed. I've been here for years. This is my home. And you? He took a step closer, raising his club. You're not welcome here. I glanced around, desperate for anything I could use to defend myself. My pack was several feet away, and I doubted I could reach it before he got to me. The fire tower loomed behind me, useless in its inaccessibility. As he advanced, I made a split-second decision. I turned and ran for the tower. I heard him shout behind me, his heavy footsteps giving chase. Reaching the base of the tower, I jumped, my fingers just barely catching the lowest rung of the ladder. For a terrifying moment, I dangled there, kicking my feet as I tried to pull myself up. I could hear him right behind me, feel the whoosh of air as he swung his club, narrowly missing my legs. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I managed to haul myself up onto the ladder. I scrambled upwards, not daring to look down. The man's enraged shouts followed me, punctuated by the clang of his club against the metal structure. I didn't stop climbing until I reached the small room at the top of the tower. I slammed the hatch shut behind me, securing it with shaking hands. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, collapsing onto the dusty floor. From below, I could hear the man's frustrated yells and the sound of him striking the tower's supports. But up here, I was safe, at least for the moment. As my panic subsided, I took stock of my surroundings. The room was small and bare, with windows on all sides offering a panoramic view of the forest. In one corner stood a defunct radio system, long since abandoned. On a long shot, I tried the radio, but as expected, it was dead. Still, being up here gave me options. I could see for miles in every direction. Somewhere out there had to be help. As night fell, the man's shouts eventually quieted, but I didn't let my guard down. I knew he was still out there, waiting. I spent a sleepless night huddled in the corner of the tower room, jumping at every sound. When dawn broke, I peered out the windows, searching for any sign of my stalker. The forest below was peaceful, showing no indication of the terror I'd experienced, but I knew appearances could be deceiving. I was trapped, yes, but I was also safe for the moment. And up here, with this bird's eye view, I had a chance to plan my next move. Somehow, some way, I would find a way out of these woods and back to safety. The man below might think he had won, but I wasn't beaten yet. As I watched the sun rise over the treetops, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had survived the night, outsmarted my pursuer. Whatever came next, I would face it with the same determination that had gotten me this far. This was no longer just about escaping the forest. It was about reclaiming my right to feel safe in the wilderness I loved. The battle wasn't over, but up here, with the whole forest spread out before me, I finally felt like I had a fighting chance. The moment I saw the glint of metal through the trees, I knew I had stumbled upon something I was never meant to see. My heart leaped into my throat as I instinctively ducked behind a fallen log, the musty smell of decaying wood filling my nostrils. What I had mistaken for an old, abandoned campsite was anything but, and in that instant, my peaceful research trip turned into a fight for survival. I'm a historian, specializing in Civil War battlefields. This trip to a remote area of Virginia was supposed to be routine, a chance to document a lesser-known skirmish site before nature reclaimed it completely. I'd spent countless hours in places like this, but never had I felt the kind of primal fear that now coursed through my veins. The day had started normally enough. I'd parked my car at the end of a long, winding dirt road and hiked several miles into the dense forest. The late summer heat was oppressive, and sweat trickled down my back as I pushed through the underbrush. My backpack, loaded with camera equipment and supplies, felt heavier with each step. I'd been following an old, overgrown path that I believed led to the battle site. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the occasional bird call breaking the silence. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw it. A clearing up ahead. Excitement bubbled up inside me as I quickened my pace. This had to be the spot. I could almost picture the soldiers who had fought and died here over 150 years ago. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, that excitement turned to confusion, and then to terror. Instead of weathered earthworks or rusted cannonballs, I saw modern camping equipment, tents, not of the Civil War era, but of high-tech fabric, were arranged in a circle. In the center was a table covered in maps and what looked like blueprints, and the guns. Oh God, the guns. They weren't historical replicas or hunting rifles. These were military-grade weapons, neatly arranged on a tarp as if ready for inspection. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This was no historical reenactment group. This was something far more sinister. Before I could retreat, a voice shattered the silence. "Hey, who's there?" I didn't think. I just ran. Crashing through the underbrush, I could hear shouts behind me and the sound of pursuit. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted blindly, fueled by pure adrenaline. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between myself and that camp as possible. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I couldn't hear anyone behind me anymore. I slowed to a stop, gasping for air. The forest around me was unfamiliar. In my panic, I'd veered far off the path I'd originally followed. As my breathing slowed, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was lost in a vast forest, being hunted by what I could only assume was some kind of militia group. My phone had no signal, and I had no idea which direction would lead me back to my car. I needed to think, to come up with a plan. First things first, I had to find water. Dehydration would kill me faster than anything else out here. I listened carefully and thought I could hear the faint sound of running water in the distance. It was as good a direction as any. As I made my way towards the sound, my mind raced. Who were those men? What were they planning? The maps, the weapons, it all pointed to something big, something dangerous. And now I was the loose end that could unravel whatever they were plotting. The sound of water grew louder, and soon I found myself at the edge of a small stream. I knelt down, cupping the cool water in my hands and drinking gratefully. As I refilled my water bottle, I tried to orient myself. The stream had to lead somewhere, perhaps to a larger river that might have a road nearby. I decided to follow the stream downstream. It was slow going, picking my way over slippery rocks and through dense vegetation. Every snapping twig made me flinch, convinced that at any moment I would see one of those armed men emerging from the trees. As the day wore on, exhaustion began to set in. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape was long gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to find help. Just as the light was beginning to fade, I saw something through the trees that made my heart leap, a structure of some kind. As I got closer, I realized it was an old hunter's cabin. It looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof, but it was the first sign of civilization I'd seen in hours. I approached cautiously, aware that it could be a trap. But the thick layer of leaves on the porch and the rusted padlock on the door suggested it hadn't been used in years. Using a rock, I managed to break the lock and force the door open. The interior was musty and dark, but it was shelter. I closed the door behind me and sank to the floor, finally allowing myself a moment to rest. My body ached, and my clothes were torn and dirty from my mad dash through the forest. As night fell, the sounds of the forest changed. Owls hooted and small animals rustled in the underbrush. Every noise made me tense, wondering if it was the militia coming to find me. I couldn't risk a fire, so I huddled in a corner of the cabin, shivering in the cool night air. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clearing with its weapons and mysterious maps. Dawn found me still awake, my eyes gritty with exhaustion. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin. It was too obvious a hiding place. I had to keep moving. As I stepped outside, a sound made me freeze. Voices, distant, but getting closer. They were still looking for me. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford to lose my head now. I had to think. The stream. If I waded through the water, it might hide my scent and make it harder to track me. It was a desperate plan, but it was all I had. I made my way back to the stream, my movements as quiet as I could make them. The water was shockingly cold as I stepped in, but I gritted my teeth and pushed on. The current was stronger than I expected, and I had to fight to keep my footing on the slippery rocks. I don't know how long I walked in that stream. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I focused solely on putting one foot in front of the other. The voices behind me faded, then disappeared entirely. But still I pushed on, terrified that if I stopped, they would find me. It was the sound of traffic that finally broke through my exhausted haze. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But as I rounded a bend in the stream, I saw it. A bridge spanning the now much wider river. And on that bridge, cars. Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. Somehow, against all odds, I had made it back to civilization. I staggered out of the stream and up the embankment to the road. A car screeched to a halt beside me, the driver's eyes wide with shock as he took in my bedraggled appearance. "Are you okay?" he asked, rolling down his window. "Do you need help?" I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He helped me into his car and drove me to the nearest police station. There, I told my story, about the camp, the weapons, the chase through the woods. The officers looked skeptical at first, but something in my eyes must have convinced them I was telling the truth. In the days that followed, as I recovered in a hospital bed, I learned that my accidental discovery had led to the arrest of a domestic terrorist group. They had been planning an attack, though the details were kept from me for security reasons. As I lay there, replaying the events in my mind, I couldn't help but marvel at the twist of fate that had led me to that clearing. What had started as a simple research trip had turned into something far more significant. I had set out to study history and instead found myself making it. The experience changed me. I still love history, still feel drawn to those old battlefields. But now I carry with me a deeper understanding of conflict and survival. Those Civil War soldiers I study fought for their lives in those forests. And in my own small way, I now know what that feels like. I know I'll return to the woods someday. The pull of history is too strong to resist. But I'll go with open eyes, aware that sometimes the most dangerous relics of the past are the ones still walking among us. The pungent scent of marijuana hit me like a wall, completely out of place in the pristine wilderness I'd been exploring for the past week. My heart rate doubled instantly as I realized I'd stumbled upon something far more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion. In that moment, I knew my peaceful botanist's expedition had just taken a potentially deadly turn. I'd been in the national park for 6 days, cataloging rare plant species for my doctoral research. It was a dream come true for a nature lover like me. Days spent hiking through lush forests, nights under a canopy of stars. I'd always felt safest in the wilderness, away from the chaos of the city. But now, as I crouched behind a fallen log, peering at the massive marijuana plantation spread out before me, I'd never felt more in danger. The clearing was huge, at least a few acres, completely hidden from aerial view by the towering trees surrounding it. Row upon row of cannabis plants stretched out, their distinctive leaves unmistakable. This was no small-time operation. This was industrial-scale drug production right in the heart of protected land. I should have turned and run right then, but curiosity, the same trait that made me a good scientist, got the better of me. I needed to document this, to gather evidence. Slowly, carefully, I pulled out my camera and started taking photos. I was so focused on capturing clear images that I almost missed the sound of voices approaching. Almost. I ducked lower behind the log, hardly daring to breathe as two men entered the clearing. They were talking in low voices, carrying large watering cans. Armed men, I realized with a jolt of fear, noticing the rifles slung across their backs. "I'm telling you, I heard something," one of them was saying. "Could be rangers. We need to check it out." The other man grunted in agreement. "Let's do a perimeter sweep. Boss'll have our heads if we let anyone stumble on this place." My blood ran cold. They were going to search the area. It was only a matter of time before they found me. I had to move now. As quietly as I could, I began to back away from my hiding spot. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot to my ears. I was about 20 feet from the clearing when disaster struck. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, falling backwards with a yelp I couldn't suppress. "There!" I heard one of the men shout. "Over there!" I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't bother trying to be quiet anymore. Speed was my only chance. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground quickly. They knew these woods. I realized with growing panic, this was their territory. A gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering bark off a tree inches from my head. "Stop or the next one won't miss," a voice bellowed. But I couldn't stop. I knew if they caught me, I'd never leave these woods alive, so I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. My lungs burned, and branches whipped at my face, but I didn't slow down. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and those armed men as possible. But as I ran, a memory surfaced. A river I'd crossed a few days ago. If I could reach it, maybe I could lose them. I changed direction, praying my memory wasn't failing me. The sounds of pursuit were growing fainter, but I didn't dare hope I'd lost them. They knew this land better than I did. They'd find my trail again soon enough. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard it, the rush of water. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I burst out of the tree line onto the riverbank, the water a churning mass before me. Without hesitation, I plunged in. The shock of the cold nearly took my breath away, but I forced myself to keep moving. The current was strong, tugging at me, trying to pull me under. But I was a strong swimmer, and fear lent me strength I didn't know I possessed. I let the river carry me downstream, away from danger. When I finally dragged myself out onto the opposite bank, I was shivering and exhausted, but alive. And more importantly, I couldn't hear any signs of pursuit. But I knew I couldn't rest. I was soaking wet in the middle of the wilderness, miles from any help, being hunted by armed drug growers. My situation was dire, to say the least. I took stock of what I had. My backpack was gone, lost in the river. All I had was the clothes on my back, my wallet, miraculously still in my pocket, and my camera, which I'd somehow managed to keep hold of during my frantic flight. The camera that held evidence of the marijuana plantation. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost, with no supplies, no map, and no way to call for help. And somewhere out there, dangerous men were looking for me. I had to find help, and fast. I picked a direction and started walking, staying close to the river. Water meant life, and it might lead me to civilization. As I walked, my mind raced. How had this happened? How had a simple research trip turned into a life or death struggle? The day wore on, and exhaustion began to set in. My wet clothes chafed, and every step was an effort, but I couldn't stop. I knew that to stop moving was to die, either from exposure or at the hands of those pursuing me. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, despair started to creep in. I'd been walking for hours with no sign of rescue. Maybe this was it. Maybe this forest would be my final resting place. But just as I was about to give up hope, I saw something that made my heart leap. A thin trail of smoke rising above the trees in the distance. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. It could be my pursuers, but at this point, I was willing to take that risk. I approached cautiously, every sense on high alert. As I got closer, I could make out voices, not the gruff tones of the men from the plantation, but lighter, cheerful sounds. Campers, I realized with a surge of relief. I stumbled into their campsite, probably looking like some kind of swamp creature. The family, a couple with 2 teenage kids, stared at me in shock. I must have been quite a sight, soaking wet, covered in scratches and bruises, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. "Please," I managed to croak out. "I need help." The next few hours passed in a blur. The family gave me dry clothes and food, and listened with growing alarm as I told them my story. They had a satellite phone, thank God, and called the park rangers. When the rangers arrived, I told them everything, showing them the photos on my camera as proof. They looked grim as they studied the images. This was big, they said, really big. They called in state police and even the DEA. As I sat wrapped in a blanket in the back of a ranger's truck, watching a flurry of law enforcement activity around me, the events of the day felt surreal. Had I really outrun armed men, swum across a raging river, and exposed a massive drug operation, all in the span of a few hours? In the days that followed, as I gave statements to various law enforcement agencies, the full scale of what I'd stumbled upon became clear. The marijuana plantation was just the tip of the iceberg. It was part of a multi-state drug trafficking operation that the authorities had been trying to crack for years. My accidental discovery had provided the break they needed. The men who had chased me were arrested in a raid a few days later. They were facing multiple felony charges. I was hailed as a hero, but I didn't feel like one. I felt lucky, grateful to be alive. As I finally returned home, I found myself changed. The forest, which had always been a place of peace and discovery for me, now held a hint of danger. I knew I'd go back eventually. My love for nature and my work were too strong to be deterred by one harrowing experience. But I'd go with open eyes, aware that even in the most beautiful places, darkness can lurk. My research trip had turned into something I never expected, a tale of survival against the odds. But it had also reminded me of the resilience of the human spirit, and the unexpected strength we can find within ourselves when pushed to the limit. As I settled back into my normal life, I carried with me a new appreciation for the preciousness of each moment and a determination to make the most of the second chance I'd been given. The first twig snap could have been a squirrel, the second maybe a deer, but the third, that was unmistakably human, and it was far too close for comfort. As I huddled behind a moss-covered boulder, my friend's excited chatter faded into the background. Something was wrong in these mountains, and I had a sickening feeling we were about to find out just how wrong. It was supposed to be the hiking trip of a lifetime. 5 friends, 10 days in the Appalachian wilderness, pushing our limits and bonding over breathtaking vistas and campfire stories. We'd been planning it for months, poring over maps and gear lists with the enthusiasm of kids planning a treasure hunt. The first 3 days had been everything we'd hoped for. The autumn air was crisp, the fall colors painting the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds. We'd tackled challenging trails, marveled at hidden waterfalls, and spent our evenings exchanging stories and dreams under a canopy of stars. But on the 4th day, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a rustle in the underbrush that didn't sound quite right. The unsettling feeling of eyes on us when we stopped for breaks. We brushed it off as paranoia, the natural unease that comes from being in unfamiliar territory. Then came the footprints. We found them at our campsite on the 5th morning, large boot prints that hadn't been there the night before, circling our tents. Mike, always the skeptic, insisted it was probably just another hiker passing through. But the prints were too deliberate, too menacing in their precision. We debated turning back, cutting our trip short, but we were deep in the back country, at least 3 days from the nearest road. Press on or turn back, we'd still be in the wilderness for days. So we decided to continue, agreeing to stay vigilant and stick together. That night, we heard it for the first time, a long, low whistle echoing through the trees. It wasn't any bird call I recognized, and judging by the looks on my friends and faces, they didn't recognize it either. We extinguished our fire early and huddled in our tents, sleep eluding us as that whistle sounded again and again through the night. The next morning, Sarah's backpack was missing. We searched the campsite frantically, but it was nowhere to be found. With it went half our food supply and our only map. The reality of our situation began to sink in. We were being stalked, toyed with by someone who knew these mountains far better than we did. We abandoned our original route, hoping to throw off whoever was following us. But as the day wore on, the sense of being watched only intensified. Twice more we heard that chilling whistle, closer each time. It was mid-afternoon when I heard those twig snaps, so close I could almost feel the presence behind them. I signaled silently to my friends, and we ducked behind whatever cover we could find. For long, tense minutes, and we waited, hardly daring to breathe. Then we saw him. A figure moved between the trees, barely more than a shadow, but it was unmistakably human and unmistakably tracking us. He moved with an eerie grace, seeming to glide over the forest floor that had been tripping us up for days. Sarah stifled a gasp, and the figure's head snapped in our direction. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought we'd been discovered. But after a painfully long pause, he moved on, disappearing into the thick underbrush. We waited until we were sure he was gone before we spoke, and even then, it was in whispers. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, his usual bravado replaced by naked fear. "Now." No one argued. We gathered our packs as quietly as we could and started moving, no longer caring about our intended route. Our only goal now was to find our way back to civilization, but the mountains seemed to have other plans. As dusk approached, a thick fog rolled in, obscuring the trail and disorienting us completely. We were lost, being hunted, and night was falling fast, and we need to find shelter, I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. We're too exposed out here. We stumbled through the deepening gloom, jumping at every shadow. The fog muffled our footsteps, but it also hid potential dangers. More than once, one of us nearly walked off the edge of a steep drop. Just as despair was starting to set in, we spotted it, a dilapidated cabin, half hidden by overgrown vegetation. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and right now, that was all that mattered. We approached cautiously, all too aware that this could be a trap, but the cabin appeared long abandoned, its windows boarded up and its door hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Inside, it was musty and dark, but dry. We used our flashlights sparingly, not wanting to alert our pursuer to our location. In hushed tones, we tried to come up with a plan. "We should take turns keeping watch," Sarah suggested. 2-hour shifts. We can't risk all being asleep if he finds us. We agreed, drawing straws to determine the order. I drew the first watch. As my friends settled in to try and sleep, I positioned myself by a crack in the boards covering the window. The night was oppressively dark, the fog seeming to swallow up even the meager light of the stars. For the first hour, all was quiet. Then, just as I was starting to think we might have lost our stalker, I heard it, that whistle, low and menacing, somewhere out in the darkness. It was answered by another whistle from a different direction, then another. My blood ran cold as I realized the horrifying truth. There wasn't just one person out there. There were several, and they had us surrounded. I woke the others, pressing my fingers to my lips to signal for silence. We huddled together in the center of the cabin, straining our ears. The whistles were getting closer, a nightmarish call and response that seemed to be closing in on us from all sides. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night, the rhythmic chopping of helicopter blades. A searchlight cut through the fog, sweeping back and forth across the forest canopy. Our pursuers' whistles abruptly ceased. For a moment, all was silent, except for the approaching helicopter. Then we heard it, the sound of running feet, quickly fading into the distance. We burst out of the cabin, waving our arms frantically and shouting at the top of our lungs. The searchlight found us, pinning us in its glare. I'd never been so happy to be blinded by a light in my life. The helicopter landed in a small clearing nearby, and park rangers poured out, followed by state police. We learned later that our families had reported us missing when we failed to check in at our scheduled time. The authorities had been searching for us for 2 days. As we were flown to safety, I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure in the woods. Who were they? What did they want? We gave statements to the police, but they seemed skeptical of our story. They found no evidence of our mysterious stalkers, no prints, no abandoned campsites, nothing except Sarah's backpack, discovered miles from where we'd lost it, its contents untouched. In the days and weeks that followed, as we tried to readjust to normal life, we pieced together theories. Maybe it was an isolationist group living off the grid. Maybe it was some kind of twisted game, hunting humans for sport. Or maybe, as the authorities seemed to believe, it was just our imaginations running wild in the isolation of the backcountry. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and sometimes, in my dreams, I still hear that whistle, calling to me from the depths of the forest. The Appalachian Trail holds many secrets, and I can't shake the feeling that we only scratched the surface of one of its darkest mysteries. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but I never go alone anymore. And I always look over my shoulder. Because I know now that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness walk on 2 legs, and they know the forest far better than we ever will. The gentle lapping of water against my canoe had always been a soothing sound, but now it filled me with dread. Each ripple could be hiding them, the men who turned my peaceful solo trip into a nightmare. As I peered into the mist-shrouded lake, I realized that the boundary waters had become my prison, and those distant shores my only hope for escape. I'd been planning this trip for months, a week-long solo adventure in the pristine wilderness of northern Minnesota. As an avid outdoorsman and nature photographer, I craved the solitude and raw beauty of the Boundary Waters canoe area. The promise of crystal-clear lakes, towering pines, and untouched wilderness had drawn me in like a siren's call. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I paddled through a maze of interconnected lakes and streams, portaging my canoe between them when necessary. Each night, I'd set up camp on a small island or secluded shore, falling asleep to the haunting calls of loons echoing across the water. It was on the 4th day that everything changed. I was exploring a narrow channel, my camera at the ready to capture the morning mist rising off the water, when I saw it. A flicker of movement on the shore caught my eye. I raised my binoculars, expecting to see a moose or maybe a black bear. Instead, I saw men, 3 of them, dressed in camouflage, loading large duffel bags into a battered aluminum boat. Even from a distance, I could see the unmistakable shape of rifles slung across their backs. This was no ordinary camping trip. I should have paddled away immediately, should have pretended I hadn't seen a thing. But curiosity got the better of me. I drifted closer, using the morning mist as cover. As I drew near, I could hear snatches of their conversation carried across the water. "Last shipment before we shut down for the season," one man was saying. "Border Patrol's been sniffing around, we can't risk." The rest was lost as a gust of wind rippled across the lake. But I'd heard enough to know I'd stumbled upon something illegal. Smugglers, using the remote wilderness to move their goods across the Canadian border. I was so focused on the men that I didn't notice my canoe drifting into a partially submerged log. The scrape of wood on wood seemed deafening in the quiet morning air. The men's heads snapped in my direction. "Hey, you there in the canoe!" one shouted. "Come over here." My heart pounding, I did the only thing I could think of. I paddled. Hard. Behind me, I could hear the roar of an outboard motor springing to life. They were coming after me. What followed was a frantic chase through the labyrinthine waterways of the Boundary Waters. I had the advantage of a lighter craft and intimate knowledge of the area from my detailed maps, but they had a motorboat and the desperation of men with something to hide. I zigged and zagged through narrow channels, ducking under low-hanging branches and scraping through reed beds too shallow for their larger boat. But always, the roar of their motor found me again. They knew these waters too, probably better than I did. As the sun climbed higher, the mist burned away, leaving me exposed. I could hear them shouting to each other, coordinating their efforts to cut me off. I was being herded, I realized with growing dread, herded towards a dead end. Sure enough, I rounded a bend to find myself in a small, circular lake with no outlet. Sheer rock cliffs rose on three sides, offering no escape. The purr of their motor grew louder as they entered the lake behind me. With no other choice, I paddled to the shore and dragged my canoe onto a narrow strip of rocky beach. I grabbed my dry bag with my supplies and plunged into the dense underbrush, the shouts of the men ringing in my ears. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my face and roots threatening to trip me at every step. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and those men as possible. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed behind a fallen tree, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of the oppressive silence of the forest. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals. It was as if the whole wilderness was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a twig snapping nearby. They were close. I held my breath, pressing myself into the damp earth. Footsteps crunched through the leaves, pausing occasionally as they searched the area. I could hear them muttering to each other, their voices low and angry. "He couldn't have gotten far," one said. "Find him. We can't let him tell anyone what he saw." The footsteps moved away, but I didn't dare move. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, waiting for them to return. But the forest remained silent. As the light began to fade, I knew I couldn't stay there. I was deep in the wilderness with minimal supplies, being hunted by dangerous men. I needed to find help, and fast. I oriented myself using the setting sun and started moving, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I knew there was a ranger station somewhere to the south, but it was miles away. Could I make it there before the smugglers found me? Or before exposure and exhaustion took their toll? The night was long and terrifying. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a pursuer closing in. I stumbled through the darkness, guided only by brief glimpses of the stars through the canopy and my own desperate determination to survive. As dawn broke, I found myself on the shore of another lake. My heart sank as I realized I'd have to find a way across. Swimming was out of the question. The water was frigid, and I'd never make it to the other side. I needed a boat. That's when I saw it. A lone canoe, pulled up on a small beach about 100 yards down the shore. It was a risk. The canoe likely belonged to my pursuers, but it was my only chance. I crept along the shoreline, keeping low and using the early morning mist as cover. As I drew closer to the canoe, I scanned the area for any sign of the smugglers. The small campsite nearby seemed deserted, but I couldn't be sure they weren't lying in wait. With my heart in my throat, I sprinted the last few yards to the canoe. I shoved it into the water and jumped in, paddling furiously towards the center of the lake. I was about halfway across when I heard angry shouts from the shore behind me. I didn't look back, just kept paddling. My arms burned with the effort, but fear lent me strength. The crack of a gunshot spurred me on, the bullet sending up a spray of water uncomfortably close to my canoe. I reached the far shore as more shots rang out, the bullets whistling overhead. I beached the canoe and ran into the woods, not daring to slow down even as my lungs screamed for air. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I pushed through the wilderness, driven by pure survival instinct. It was the sound of a motor that finally broke through my panic-induced haze. Not the whine of an outboard, but the deeper rumble of a truck engine. I changed direction, moving towards the sound. It grew louder, and suddenly I burst out of the tree line onto a dirt road. An old pickup truck was idling there, a startled-looking man in a park ranger uniform staring at me in shock. "Please," I gasped, stumbling towards him. "Help me. There are men. They're after me." The ranger helped me into his truck, his face grave as I poured out my story between gasping breaths. He radioed for backup as he drove us to the ranger station, casting worried glances at the woods around us. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and medical checks. The authorities took my information seriously, launching a full-scale search of the area. They found evidence of the smuggling operation, but the men themselves had vanished. As I finally left the ranger station, headed for home and safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd only scratched the surface of something much bigger. The Boundary Waters had always seemed like the last true wilderness, a place untouched by the darker aspects of humanity. Now I knew better. I still love the outdoors, still feel the pull of wild places, but now I go with open eyes, aware that even in the most remote corners of the world, we're never truly alone. And sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones that walk on two legs. The flash of my camera shattered the stillness of the Everglades, capturing more than just the rare bird I'd been tracking. In that split second, I became a witness to something I was never meant to see, and my peaceful research expedition transformed into a desperate fight for survival. I'm a wildlife photographer, specializing in endangered species. The Everglades had always been a goldmine for my work, teeming with unique creatures found nowhere else on Earth. This trip was supposed to be like any other. 2 weeks of wading through swamps, battling mosquitoes, and hopefully capturing some breathtaking shots of the elusive Florida panther. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the familiar rhythms of life in the swamp. I'd wake before dawn, eat a quick breakfast of granola bars, and set out in my small boat. Hours would pass as I navigated the maze-like waterways, camera at the ready. It was on the 5th day that everything changed. I'd ventured further into the Everglades than ever before, following rumors of panther sightings in a particularly remote area. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I decided to make camp on a small, dry patch of land. I was setting up my tent when I heard it, the low rumble of an airboat engine, out of place in this isolated part of the swamp. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed my camera with its powerful zoom lens and made my way to the water's edge. The airboat came into view, laden with large, tarp-covered crates. 3 men were aboard, their faces obscured by the growing darkness. They beached the boat on a nearby mudflat and began unloading their cargo with practiced efficiency. I raised my camera, thinking I might be witnessing some kind of wildlife trafficking operation. But as I zoomed in, and the flash went off automatically in the low light, I realized my mistake too late. The men froze, then whirled in my direction. I ducked down, but I knew it was futile. They had seen the flash, heard the click of the shutter. They knew someone was watching. "Hey, who's there?" a gruff voice called out. "Show yourself." My heart pounding, I stayed low, hoping against hope that they might think it was just some animal. But the sound of them revving up the airboat told me they weren't taking any chances. I grabbed my emergency backpack, always packed and ready for a quick escape, and plunged into the swamp. The water was waist-deep and tepid, filled with unseen creatures that brushed against my legs as I sloshed through the muck. Behind me, I could hear the airboat getting closer. Its fan propeller roared, drowning out the normal nighttime sounds of the Everglades. I pushed harder, struggling against the water's resistance and the treacherous, unseen bottom. I reached a stand of mangroves and ducked behind their twisted roots, trying to control my ragged breathing. The airboat slowed, its occupants scanning the shoreline with powerful flashlights. "Spread out," I heard one of them say. Whoever it was couldn't have gotten far in this swamp. I knew I couldn't stay put. It was only a matter of time before they found me. But which way to go? In the darkness, with the adrenaline coursing through my veins, I had lost all sense of direction. I chose a direction at random and started moving, trying to stay as quiet as possible in the noisy swamp. Every step was a challenge. The bottom was a treacherous mix of soft mud and hidden obstacles. More than once, I nearly fell face first into the murky water. The sounds of pursuit were ever present. Sometimes they seemed to fade, only to come roaring back louder than ever. I had no idea if I was heading towards safety or deeper into danger. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. My legs ached from constantly fighting against the water, and my skin burned from countless mosquito bites. But I couldn't stop. I knew that to stop was to die, either from exposure in the unforgiving swamp or at the hands of my pursuers. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw it, a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I pushed towards the light, no longer caring about the noise I was making. As I got closer, I realized it was a small cabin, perched on stilts above the water. A weather-beaten sign identified it as a ranger station. I've never been so happy to see anything in my life. I stumbled up the stairs and pounded on the door, casting fearful glances over my shoulder. "Help! Please! Is anyone there?" The door opened, revealing a startled-looking ranger. "What in the world?" he exclaimed, taking in my bedraggled appearance. I pushed past him into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. "Please," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "There are men after me. I saw something I shouldn't have." The ranger's expression turned serious. He locked the door and quickly closed all the shutters. "Start from the beginning," he said, grabbing his radio. "What exactly did you see?" I told him everything. The airboat, the mysterious cargo, the chase through the swamp. As I spoke, I could see his face growing grimmer. "I was afraid of this," he muttered, mostly to himself. Then, into the radio. "This is Ranger Michaels at Station 17. We've got a Code 3 situation, possible smuggling operation in Sector 9, requesting immediate backup." The response was immediate. "Copy that, Station 17. Backup is on the way. ETA 20 minutes. Stay put and keep the witness safe." The ranger, Michaels, turned back to me. "You're lucky you made it here," he said. "This part of the Everglades is a known route for smugglers. We've been trying to catch them in the act for months." A sudden noise outside made us both freeze. The unmistakable sound of an airboat engine, quickly growing louder. Michaels sprang into action, grabbing a shotgun from a locked cabinet. "Stay low and away from the windows," he ordered, his voice tense but controlled. I huddled in a corner as Michaels took up position near the door. The airboat's engine cut off, replaced by the sound of voices and footsteps on the wooden deck. A fist pounded on the door. "Open up! Park rangers!" Michaels didn't move. "Identify yourself," he called back. There was a pause. Then, "You know who we are, Michaels. Open the door, or we'll open it for you." My blood ran cold. They knew the ranger by name. This was worse than I thought. Michael's face was grim. "Not happening," he shouted. "Backup's on the way. Your smuggling days are over." The response was immediate and terrifying. Gunshots rang out, splintering the wooden door. Michaels ducked and returned fire, the shotgun's blast deafening in the small cabin. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of my life. A furious gun battle raged around me as I cowered on the floor, praying that help would arrive before it was too late. And then, suddenly, it was over. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air, and I heard shouts of, "Police! Drop your weapons!" When I finally dared to look up, the cabin was a mess of broken glass and bullet holes. Michaels was slumped against the wall, clutching his bleeding arm but very much alive. Outside, I could see the smugglers being handcuffed and led away. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and medical checkups. My photos, it turned out, provided crucial evidence in breaking up a major smuggling ring that had been operating in the Everglades for years. As I finally headed home, exhausted but alive, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly my peaceful expedition had turned into a life-or-death struggle. The Everglades, which I had always seen as a sanctuary, now held a darker, more dangerous aspect in my mind. I still love wildlife photography, still feel drawn to wild places. But now I go with open eyes, aware that even in the most beautiful landscapes, human darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. My camera captured more than rare animals on that trip. It captured a stark reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones that walk on two legs. The roar of ATV engines shattered the tranquil evening, echoing off the Black Hills like rolling thunder. In that moment, as 5 riders tore into my campsite, I knew my peaceful solo getaway had just taken a dangerous turn. Little did I know, this intrusion was only the beginning of a nightmarish ordeal that would push me to my limits. I'd come to the Black Hills seeking solitude and a chance to clear my head after a grueling year at work. The promise of pristine forests, rugged terrain, and star-filled nights had drawn me to this remote spot, far from the usual tourist trails. For 2 blissful days, it had been everything I'd hoped for, just me, my tent, and the wild beauty of nature. As the sun began to set on my 3rd day, I was sitting by my small campfire, lost in thought and enjoying the simple pleasure of roasting a marshmallow. The sudden intrusion of mechanical noise jerked me back to reality. Before I could even process what was happening, 5 ATVs burst into the clearing, their riders whooping and hollering like they owned the place. They circled my campsite, kicking up dirt and leaves before coming to a stop. The engines cut off, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. 5 men dismounted, all looking to be in their late 20s or early 30s. They were a rough-looking bunch, dressed in a mishmash of leather and denim, with wild hair and wilder eyes. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the largest of the group said, stepping forward. He was a bear of a man, with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. "Looks like we found ourselves a city boy playing explorer." I stood up slowly, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "Evening, gentlemen. I'm just camping here for a few days. Plenty of room in these hills for all of us, right?" The man, clearly the leader, laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I don't know about that. See, these are our woods, and we don't take kindly to strangers trespassing on our turf." My heart began to race. I'd heard stories of territorial locals in remote areas, but I'd always thought they were exaggerated. Now, faced with 5 angry men and miles from any help, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched. "Look," I said, forcing a smile, "I didn't mean to trespass. If this is your spot, I'd be happy to pack up and move along." The leader exchanged glances with his friends, a silent communication passing between them. Then he turned back to me, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Oh, you'll be moving along all right. But first, I think we're going to have some fun." What followed was a nightmare of psychological torment and destruction. They ransacked my campsite, tearing open my tent and scattering my supplies. They found my cooler and helped themselves to my beer, growing louder and more belligerent with each can they emptied. I stood by helplessly, knowing that any attempt to stop them would likely end in violence. Every time I tried to speak up or move towards my things, one of them would step in front of me, a threatening gleam in his eye. As night fell, their fun escalated. They took turns target practicing on my camping gear, using my pots and pans for skeet shooting. The sound of gunshots echoed through the hills, each blast making me flinch. "Please," I finally said, unable to stay silent any longer. "Just take what you want and go. I won't report this, I swear." The leader turned to me, his eyes glassy from alcohol but still menacing. "Report it? To who? There ain't no law out here but us." He gestured expansively, encompassing the dark forest around us. "This is our kingdom, city boy, and you're about to learn what happens to trespassers in our kingdom." Fear, cold and sharp, settled in my stomach. I realized with growing horror that they had no intention of simply robbing me and leaving. This was a game to them, and it was far from over. As if to confirm my fears, one of the men grabbed a burning log from my fire and hurled it at my tent. The nylon fabric caught immediately, flames licking up the sides with terrifying speed. "No!" I yelled, starting forward. But two of the men grabbed me, holding me back as I watched everything I had brought with me go up in flames. The leader stepped close, his breath hot on my face and reeking of beer. "Here's what's gonna happen, city boy. We're gonna give you a 10-minute head start. Then we're coming after you. If you make it out of these hills alive, well, consider it a learning experience. If not..." He shrugged, leaving the implications hanging in the air. They shoved me towards the dark line of trees, laughing as I stumbled. "Better start running," one of them called. "Clock's ticking." For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Then survival instinct kicked in, and I ran. I plunged into the forest, branches whipping my face as I crashed through the underbrush. Behind me, I could hear them counting down, their voices carrying clearly through the night air. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and those men as possible. But the forest was dark and unfamiliar, every shadow seeming to hide a potential threat. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard the roar of ATV engines starting up. The hunt was on. I veered off the faint trail I'd been following, opting for denser underbrush in the hope it would slow down their vehicles. The sound of the ATVs grew closer, then faded, then came back again. They were sweeping the area, methodically searching for me. Twice, I had to dive for cover as they passed nearby, their headlights cutting through the darkness. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and countless scratches stung my face and arms. But I couldn't stop. I knew that to stop was to die, or worse. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw something that made my heart leap. Lights in the distance. Not the harsh glare of ATV headlights, but the steady glow of buildings, civilization, safety. Renewed hope gave me a second wind. I pushed towards the lights, no longer caring about the noise I was making. Behind me, I heard shouts as my pursuers realized where I was headed. I burst out of the tree line onto a paved road, the lights resolving into a small gas station. Without looking back, I sprinted towards it, my feet pounding on the asphalt. The bell jingled as I crashed through the door, startling the sleepy-looking attendant behind the counter. "Please," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "Call the police. There are men after me." The attendant, to his credit, didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and dialed, his eyes wide as he took in my disheveled, terrified state. As we waited for the police to arrive, I sank to the floor, my back against the counter. Every headlight that passed on the road made me flinch, certain that my pursuers had found me. But they never came. Perhaps the prospect of witnesses was enough to deter them. When the police finally arrived, I told them everything. They took my statement and sent out patrols to search for the men, but I knew it was unlikely they'd be found. The Black Hills were vast, and those men knew them far better than any police officer. As I sat in the back of a patrol car, being driven to the nearest town, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly my peaceful retreat had turned into a life-or-death struggle. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just days ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. I still love nature, still feel the pull of wild places, but now I go with open eyes, aware that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness are the ones that walk on two legs. My solo camping days are behind me, but the lessons I learned in those dark hills will stay with me forever. In the end, I escaped with my life, but I left behind more than just my gear in those woods. I left behind a piece of my innocence and gained a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. The first note appeared innocently enough, pinned to a tree near my campsite. "Leave now," it read in jagged, hurried script. I laughed it off as a prank, but as the sun dipped below the smoky mountain peaks, that laughter died in my throat. Little did I know, those 2 words were the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me long after I left these mountains behind. I'd come to the Smokies for a week of solitude and reflection. My life back in the city had become a chaotic whirlwind of deadlines and expectations, and I desperately needed to disconnect. The promise of misty mountains, babbling brooks, and starry nights drew me in like a siren's call. For the first 2 days, it was everything I'd hoped for. I hiked until my legs ached, marveling at the lush forests and breathtaking vistas. At night, I sat by my campfire, listening to the symphony of crickets and owls, feeling more at peace than I had in years. It was on the 3rd morning that things began to feel off. I woke to find my camping gear rearranged, not dramatically, but enough to notice. My backpack, which I always left by the tent entrance, was now propped against a tree several feet away. The camping stove I'd left on a flat rock was now on the ground. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had rummaged through the site while I slept. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The movements were too deliberate, too precise. That's when I saw the note. At first I chuckled, assuming it was left by an overzealous park ranger or perhaps a grumpy local. But as the day wore on, the words began to nag at me. The handwriting was too messy for an official notice, and there was something unsettling about the urgency of the message. I decided to ignore it. I was here to relax, after all, not to let some childish prank get under my skin. I spent the day exploring a nearby creek, even managing to catch a couple of small trout for dinner. But as I sat by my fire that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig made me jump. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the note had just set me on edge. Still, I turned in earlier than usual, zipping myself securely into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily. I drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, jerking awake at every sound. It was during one of these wakeful moments that I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves outside my tent. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps paused right outside the tent. Then, after a moment that felt like an eternity, they moved away. I lay there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent, I found my campsite in disarray. My belongings were scattered about, and there, pinned to the same tree as before, was another note. "This is your last warning. Leave or you'll regret it." Fear coiled in my stomach like a cold, heavy snake. This was no longer a prank. Someone was out there. Someone who clearly didn't want me here. I started packing up my gear with shaking hands. Rational thought warred with growing panic. Should I hike out? Call for help? But I was miles from any cell service, and the nearest ranger station was a day's hike away. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard a twig snap nearby. I whirled around, my heart in my throat. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a man. He was tall and gaunt, with a wild beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. But it was his eyes that caught me, cold and hard, filled with a hostility that made my blood run cold. "You're still here," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm leaving. Right now. I don't want any trouble." He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. "Trouble," he snarled. "You brought trouble here the moment you set foot on my land." "Your land?" I stammered. "But this is a national park. It's public land." The man's face contorted with rage. "Public? There's nothing public about these mountains. My family has lived here for generations. We were here long before your government decided to draw lines on a map and call it theirs." I held up my hands in what I hoped was a placating gesture. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. Like I said, I'm leaving. You'll never see me again. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes boring into me. Then, almost casually, he reached behind his back and pulled out a long, wicked-looking knife. My heart nearly stopped. "No," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I don't think you understand. You can't just leave. You've seen me now. You'll tell them about me." I shook my head frantically. "I won't tell anyone, I swear. Please, just let me go." But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me, that he had no intention of letting me leave these mountains alive. What happened next was a blur of terror and adrenaline. As he lunged forward, I threw my sleeping bag at him, momentarily tangling him up. I used that split second to run, abandoning my gear and plunging into the thick underbrush. I ran like I'd never run before, branches whipping my face and roots threatening to trip me at every step. I could hear him crashing through the woods behind me, his enraged shouts echoing off the mountains. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that madman as possible. But he knew these woods far better than I did. No matter how fast I ran, how many twists and turns I took, I could hear him getting closer. Just as I felt my strength beginning to give out, I saw something through the trees, a structure of some kind. As I got closer, I realized it was an old fire tower. Hope surged through me. If I could reach it, maybe I could signal for help, or at least have a defensible position. I scrambled up the metal stairs, my legs burning with the effort. I could hear my pursuer at the base of the tower as I reached the small room at the top. I slammed the trapdoor shut and looked around frantically for something to barricade it with. There wasn't much in the room, just an old desk and chair and some abandoned equipment. I dragged the desk over the trapdoor just as I heard the man start to climb the stairs. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I realized I was trapped. But then I saw it, an old radio system in the corner. With shaking hands, I turned it on, praying it still worked. To my immense relief, it crackled to life. I quickly found an emergency channel and began broadcasting a distress call, giving my location and describing my situation. The man reached the trap door, pounding on it and shouting threats. The desk shuddered with each blow, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Just as the desk began to slide, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a helicopter. Help had come. The man must have heard it too, because the pounding suddenly stopped. When the rescue team reached the tower, they found me huddled in the corner, shaken but alive. Of the man, there was no sign. He had vanished back into the wilderness he called home. In the days that followed, as I gave statements to the park rangers and police, I learned that there had been rumors for years about a hermit living in the remote parts of the Smokies. Some believed he was a fugitive, others that he was just a man who wanted to be left alone. But no one had ever been able to prove his existence until now. They never found him, despite an extensive search. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, defending his perceived territory against unwitting intruders like myself. I still love nature, still feel drawn to wild places. But now, I go with open eyes, aware that the wilderness holds secrets and dangers beyond what most of us can imagine. Those few days in the Smokies taught me a harsh lesson about the thin line between civilization and savagery, and how quickly that line can blur when we venture into the truly wild places of the world. As I sit here, safe in my city apartment, I can still hear the wind whispering through the Smoky Mountain pines. But now, that whisper carries a warning. Some parts of the wilderness don't want to be explored. Some secrets are best left undiscovered. And sometimes, the most dangerous predator in the forest is the one that walks on two legs. The moment I stepped into the Hardings' quaint cottage, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Their smiles were warm, their hospitality effusive, but something in their eyes made my skin crawl. I should have trusted my instincts and left right then. Instead, I stayed for dinner, unknowingly setting in motion a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. I had come to this tiny village nestled in the hills for my anthropology thesis. The plan was to spend a month studying the traditional lifestyle and customs of this isolated community. It was meant to be the cornerstone of my graduate work, a deep dive into a way of life that was rapidly disappearing in our modern world. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The villagers were friendly, if a bit reserved, and I filled notebook after notebook with observations and interviews. I stayed at a small inn on the outskirts of the village, a cozy place run by a grandmotherly woman who fussed over me like I was her long-lost grandchild. It was on my third evening that I met the Hardings. I was having dinner at the local cafe when they approached my table, introducing themselves as longtime residents eager to help with my research. Mr. Harding was a tall, lean man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. His wife was shorter, plump, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We'd love to have you over for dinner tomorrow," Mrs. Harding said, her voice syrupy sweet. "We can tell you stories about the village that go back generations." I agreed enthusiastically, thrilled at the prospect of gaining deeper insights into the community. The next evening, I made my way to their cottage on the edge of the village. It was a picturesque place, with flower boxes in the windows and smoke curling from the chimney. The dinner was delicious, a hearty meal of local specialties. The Hardings were charming hosts, regaling me with tales of village history and folklore. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice odd details. The way they would exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. The pointed questions about my family, my background, my plans. "So, you're here all alone?" Mr. Harding asked, refilling my wine glass. "No one back home expecting you?" I laughed nervously. "Just my thesis advisor, but he knows I'll be out of touch for a while." Something flashed in Mrs. Harding's eyes at that, something that made my stomach tighten. But I brushed it off, blaming it on too much wine and an overactive imagination. As I was leaving, they invited me to come back the next day. "We have some old photos and documents that might be useful for your research," Mr. Harding said. "Things we don't show to just anyone," I agreed, my academic curiosity overriding the unease that had been building all evening. That night, back in my room at the inn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important. But exhaustion soon took over, and I fell into a troubled sleep. The next day, I spent the morning interviewing other villagers. To my surprise, when I mentioned the Hardings, people became evasive. One old woman even made a sign to ward off evil when I said their names. It was strange, but I chalked it up to small-town politics and rivalries. In the afternoon, I made my way back to the Hardings' cottage. This time, Mrs. Harding answered the door alone. "Oh, I'm so glad you came," she said, ushering me in. "Harold's just gone to fetch those documents we mentioned. He'll be back soon." She sat me down in the living room and brought me a cup of tea. As I sipped it, I began to feel dizzy. The room seemed to tilt and spin. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. What's happening?" I slurred, the teacup slipping from my numb fingers. Mrs. Harding's face swam into view, her expression no longer warm but coldly triumphant. "Don't fight it, dear," she said softly. "It'll be easier if you just let go." That was the last thing I remember before darkness took me. I woke up in a small, windowless room. My head was pounding, and my mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized with growing horror that I was trapped. The door was solid wood, with no handle on the inside. The walls were bare except for dozens of photographs, all of young women who looked terrified. Panic set in as I realized the full extent of my situation. I wasn't the first person the Hardings had lured in, and if I didn't find a way out, I wouldn't be the last. Days blended together in that room. The Hardings would bring me food and water, always careful to keep the door blocked when they entered. They talked about preserving the old ways and how I would help continue the lineage. Their words were kind, but their eyes were cold and fanatical. I tried reasoning with them, pleading, even threatening. Nothing worked. They were convinced that what they were doing was right, that they were chosen to maintain the purity of their bloodline. As time passed, I began to lose hope. No one knew exactly where I was. The villagers, if they suspected anything, were too afraid to act. I was truly alone. But then, on what I think was the 10th day of my captivity, I saw my chance. Mrs. Harding came in to bring my meal, but she stumbled, distracted by something Mr. Harding was saying in the hallway. For just a moment, the door was unguarded. I didn't think. I just acted. I shoved past her with strength born of desperation and ran. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit, but I didn't look back. I ran through the house and out into the night, my bare feet slapping against the cold ground. The village was dark and silent as I tore through it. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to get as far away from that house of horrors as possible. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, and my feet were cut and bleeding, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I found myself on a road leading out of the village. In the distance, I saw headlights approaching. Desperate and terrified, I flagged down the car. It was a couple returning from a late night in the nearby town. They took one look at my wild eyes and disheveled appearance and knew something was terribly wrong. I babbled out my story as they drove me to the nearest police station in the larger town down the mountain. The officers were skeptical at first, but something in my eyes must have convinced them. They took my statement and sent out patrols to investigate. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews and medical examinations. They found the Hardings' house empty, with evidence that they had fled in a hurry. The photographs I had seen were still there, silent testimony to years of abductions and terror. As the investigation unfolded, a horrifying picture emerged. The Hardings were part of a cult that had existed in secret for generations, believing they were preserving some ancient bloodline. They had been abducting young women for years, using the isolated nature of the village to hide their crimes. Many of the villagers, it turned out, had suspected something was wrong but were too afraid to speak out. The Hardings had wielded considerable influence in the community, their family having been prominent in the area for centuries. In the end, the Hardings were caught trying to cross the border into a neighboring country. They went to prison, and I testified at their trial, but the ordeal left deep scars, both physical and emotional. It took years of therapy before I could sleep through the night without nightmares. I never finished my thesis. The thought of returning to anthropology, of studying isolated communities, filled me with dread. Instead, I channeled my experiences into advocacy work, helping other survivors of abduction and cult abuse. Sometimes, I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling the walls of that tiny room closing in on me. But then I remind myself that I'm safe, that I escaped, that I survived. And in those moments, I feel a fierce pride in my own resilience. My experience taught me that evil can lurk behind the most benign facades, that danger can be found in the most unexpected places. But it also showed me the strength of the human spirit, the will to survive against all odds. I'll never be the same person I was before I entered that village. But in many ways, I'm stronger, more cautious, yes, but also more aware, more alive. Every day is a gift, a reminder that I beat the odds, that I reclaimed my freedom and my life. And if my story can help others, can shed light on the darkness that exists in the hidden corners of our world, then perhaps some good can come from those terrifying days. Because in the end, the greatest victory over those who sought to destroy me is to live, to thrive, and to ensure that their evil does not remain hidden in the shadows. The abandoned campsite looked like a scene from a horror movie. Torn fabric fluttered from a collapsed tent, and personal belongings were strewn across the forest floor as if their owners had vanished into thin air. As I stood there, Surrounded by my wide-eyed friends, a chill ran down my spine. We had stumbled upon something we were never meant to see, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone in these woods. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. 5 friends, 3 days of hiking and camping in one of the most beautiful national parks in the country. We had been planning this trip for months, eagerly anticipating the chance to disconnect from our busy lives and reconnect with nature and each other. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We hiked challenging trails, marveled at breathtaking vistas, and spent our evenings around the campfire, sharing stories and dreams under a canopy of stars. It felt like we were the only people in the world, surrounded by the raw beauty of the wilderness. On the 3rd day, we decided to venture off the main trail, eager to explore a secluded area rumored to have a hidden waterfall. The path was overgrown and barely visible in places, but our sense of adventure pushed us forward. That's when we found it, the abandoned campsite that would change everything. At first, we approached with curiosity rather than caution. Maybe someone had left in a hurry due to bad weather, we reasoned. But as we got closer, the signs of struggle became impossible to ignore. Deep grooves in the earth suggested a violent scuffle. A backpack lay open, its contents spilling out, including a smartphone with a cracked screen still displaying an unsent distress message. "Guys, I don't like this," Sarah whispered, voicing the fear we all felt. "We should go back and report this to the rangers." Mike, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize the scene. "It's probably just some prank. You know how people are, always trying to scare other campers." But the fear in his eyes betrayed his words. We all knew this was no prank. As we debated our next move, a sound from the surrounding forest froze us in place. It was a low whistle, followed by another from a different direction, then another. We were surrounded. "Run!" I shouted, and we took off back the way we had come. Panic fueled our flight through the dense underbrush. Branches whipped at our faces, and roots threatened to trip us at every step. The whistles continued, sometimes fading, sometimes growing alarmingly close. Whoever or whatever was out there seemed to be toying with us. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we burst into a small clearing. Gasping for breath, we huddled together, straining our ears for any sign of pursuit. "What the hell was that?" Jake panted, his usual bravado replaced by naked fear. Before anyone could answer, a twig snapped nearby. We whirled towards the sound, hearts pounding. From the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged. It was a man, but unlike any I'd seen before. He was tall and gaunt, with wild, matted hair and clothes that hung in tatters from his frame. His eyes, glinting in the fading light, held a feral intensity that made my blood run cold. For a moment, we all stood frozen, staring at each other in shocked silence. Then, without warning, the man let out a piercing whistle. It was answered immediately by others, much closer than before. We ran again, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Our only thought was to put as much distance between ourselves and that terrifying figure as possible. But the forest seemed to be working against us. Thorny vines tore at our clothes, and the ground became treacherously uneven. I was in the lead when it happened. The earth suddenly gave way beneath my feet, and I found myself tumbling down a steep embankment. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and bruised, the voices of my friends growing distant above me. As I struggled to my feet, I realized with horror that I was no longer alone. Shadowy figures moved at the edges of my vision, converging on me from all sides. I opened my mouth to scream for help, but a rough hand clamped over it, stifling my cries. "Quiet," a gravelly voice hissed in my ear. "Unless you want to die here." I was dragged deeper into the shadows, away from where I could hear my friends calling my name. My captor pulled me into a small cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. Inside, the faint glow of a dying fire illuminated several faces, all as wild and unkempt as the first man we'd seen. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out once the hand was removed from my mouth. "Please, just let me go. We didn't mean to intrude." A woman, her face lined with dirt and what looked like ritual scarification, stepped forward. "Intrude? You've done more than intrude, city dweller. You've seen what you were never meant to see." As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to make out more details of my surroundings. The cave walls were covered in strange symbols and crude drawings. Piles of scavenged items, everything from camping gear to more modern technologies, were stacked in corners. With a jolt, I realized some of it must have come from the abandoned campsite we'd stumbled upon. "Who are you people?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The woman's eyes narrowed. "We are the true children of the forest. We've lived here for generations, protecting these lands from the corruption of your world. And now, you and your friends threaten everything." Outside, I could hear the continued calls of my friends, growing more frantic by the minute. The woman gestured to one of the men. "Deal with them. Make sure they leave, but don't harm them. Yet, we need to decide what to do." As the man left, panic surged through me. "Please," I begged. "They're innocent. We all are. We didn't know." "Silence," the woman snapped. "Your ignorance doesn't absolve you. You've seen our home, our way of life. If word gets out, others will come. We'll be hunted, studied, destroyed." The gravity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. These people weren't just hermits or survivalists. They were an entire society, hidden away from the modern world, fiercely protecting their isolation. And now, we had stumbled into the middle of it. Hours passed in tense silence. I could hear muffled discussions among my captors, but couldn't make out the words. Eventually, the man who had left returned. "It's done," he reported. "I led them in circles until they found the main trail. They're gone." The woman nodded, then turned her attention back to me. "Now, we must decide your fate." What followed was a debate in a language I didn't understand. Voices were raised, arguments made, but I was helpless to contribute or even comprehend. Finally, the woman turned to me again. "We've reached a decision," she said, her voice grave. "You will stay with us, learn our ways, become one of us. It's the only way to ensure our secret remains safe." "What? No?" I protested. "I can't just disappear. People will come looking for me." The woman's expression hardened. "Then you'd better hope they don't find us. For their sake, and yours." The next days, or was it weeks? Time lost all meaning in the perpetual twilight of the forest, were a blur of fear, confusion, and gradual acceptance. I was watched constantly, taught their strange customs and primitive survival skills. Slowly, I began to understand their way of life, their deep connection to the forest that went beyond anything I'd ever experienced. But I never stopped looking for a way out. I knew my friends, my family, must be searching for me. I couldn't let them suffer, thinking I was dead. And despite the beauty and primal allure of this hidden world, it wasn't mine. I didn't belong here. My chance came during a torrential rainstorm. The cave flooded, forcing us to higher ground. In the chaos of the evacuation, I managed to slip away. I ran through the rain-soaked forest, my heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. Behind me, I could hear shouts and those chilling whistles, but I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing at the base of a large tree. As I sat there, gasping for breath, a sound cut through the patter of rain on leaves. A helicopter. Search and rescue. With the last of my strength, I crawled into a clearing and waved frantically. The spotlight found me, and soon, I was being lifted to safety. The aftermath was a whirlwind of debriefings, medical checks, and reunions. I told the authorities everything, but searches of the area turned up nothing. It was as if the hidden tribe had vanished into the forest itself. Sometimes, I wonder if it was all some vivid hallucination brought on by fear and isolation. But then, I'll catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and see the faint scars from my time in the forest. Or I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of those eerie whistles echoing in my dreams. I still love nature, still feel drawn to wild places. But now I go with open eyes, aware that the wilderness holds secrets beyond our understanding. And sometimes, when I'm hiking a remote trail, I'll feel eyes watching me from the shadows. In those moments, I know that there are still places in this world where ancient ways endure, hidden just beyond the veil of our modern existence. The old cabin loomed before me, its weathered boards and sagging roof a stark contrast to the pristine wilderness surrounding it. As I approached, a sense of unease settled in my gut. I'd come to the Ozarks seeking solitude, but something about this abandoned structure whispered of secrets and hidden dangers. If only I'd listened to that inner voice, I might have avoided the nightmare that was about to unfold. I'd been hiking for days, relishing the escape from my high-stress job in the city. The Ozark Mountains had always called to me, their rugged beauty and rich folklore drawing me like a moth to flame. This solo trip was meant to be a reset, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. The first few days had been blissful. I'd trekked through dense forests, marveled at hidden waterfalls, and spent nights under a canopy of stars so brilliant it took my breath away. But as I ventured deeper into the backcountry, I began to feel watched. It was subtle at first, a rustle in the underbrush that didn't sound quite right, the sensation of eyes on me when I stopped to rest. I told myself it was just my imagination, the natural unease that comes from being alone in the wilderness. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. On the fourth day, I stumbled upon the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, looking like it had been abandoned for decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, sending a shiver down my spine. The interior was dim and musty, filled with the remnants of a life long abandoned. Dust-covered furniture, shelves lined with ancient canned goods, and tattered curtains that stirred in the breeze from the open door. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed something odd. A trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden under a ragged rug. My heart began to race. What lay beneath? My rational mind said it was probably just a root cellar, but the atmosphere of the cabin had me on edge. I knelt down, my hand hovering over the iron ring that served as a handle. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching the cabin. I froze, torn between hiding and making a run for it. Before I could decide, a shadow fell across the doorway. The man who stood there was like something out of a nightmare, tall and gaunt, with wild, matted hair and clothes that hung in tatters from his frame. But it was his eyes that terrified me the most, pale blue and filled with a mixture of rage and madness. "Well, well," he growled, his voice rough from disuse. "Looks like I caught myself a trespasser." I raised my hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't know anyone lived here. I was just exploring." "Exploring," he spat. "This ain't no tourist attraction, boy. This is my home, and you ain't welcome here." He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. My heel caught on the edge of the trapdoor, and I stumbled, falling backwards. The last thing I saw was the man lunging towards me, then darkness as my head struck something hard. I awoke to pain and darkness. My head throbbed, and when I tried to move, I realized with growing horror that I was bound. Rough rope bit into my wrists and ankles. I was lying on a cold, damp earthen floor, the root cellar beneath the trapdoor, I realized. "Hello," I called out, my voice hoarse and trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the scurrying of what I prayed were just rats. How long had I been unconscious? Hours, Days. The darkness was absolute, disorienting. Time lost all meaning in that lightless pit. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind conjuring terrifying scenarios of what might happen to me. Would anyone even know to look for me here? I'd told my family I was going hiking, but in an area this vast, finding one missing person would be nearly impossible. I'm not sure how long I'd been there when I heard the trapdoor creak open. Light, painfully bright after the darkness, flooded the cellar. I squinted up to see the man descending a rickety ladder, a lantern in one hand and a plate in the other. "Eat," he grunted, setting the plate beside me. It held a meager portion of beans and what looked like tough, stringy meat. My stomach revolted at the sight, but hunger won out. He loosened the ropes on my wrist just enough for me to eat. As I choked down the unappetizing meal, I tried to reason with him. "Please," I said between bites, "just let me go. I won't tell anyone about this place, I swear." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Oh, I know you won't, because you ain't ever leaving these woods." A chill ran through me at his words. "Why?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Why are you doing this?" His eyes took on a faraway look. "This land," he said, gesturing vaguely upwards. "It's been in my family for generations. We lived here long before the government came in, calling it a park and trying to push us out. But we didn't leave. We just went deeper." He fixed me with a penetrating stare. "And now you city folk come traipsing through, thinking you can just take whatever you want. Well, I'm here to tell you, these woods take back. They take, and they keep." With that cryptic statement, he gathered up the plate and climbed back up the ladder. The trapdoor slammed shut, plunging me back into darkness. The days that followed were a nightmare of isolation, fear, and increasing desperation. The man would appear periodically with food and water, sometimes talking for hours about the old ways and how the modern world was destroying everything. Other times, he'd sit in silence, just watching me with those unnerving pale eyes. I tried everything I could think of to escape. I worked at the ropes until my wrists were raw and bleeding. I pleaded. I reasoned. I even tried to overpower him once when he got too close. But he was far stronger than his gaunt frame suggested, and that attempt earned me a beating that left me barely conscious. As time wore on, I began to lose hope. The darkness of the cellar seemed to seep into my very soul. I thought of my family, my friends, wondering if they were looking for me or if they'd given me up for dead. The man's words echoed in my mind. These woods take back, they take, and they keep. But just when I was on the verge of giving up entirely, fate intervened. A thunderstorm rolled in, more violent than any I'd ever experienced. The cellar began to flood, water seeping in through the earthen walls. The man appeared, cursing as he dragged me up the ladder. "Damn rain's gonna wash out the whole hillside," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He shoved me into a corner of the cabin, quickly tying me to a sturdy wooden post. "Don't you get any ideas," he growled. "I'll be right back." As soon as he was out the door, I began working frantically at my bonds. The ropes, damp from the flooded cellar, were slightly looser than before. I twisted and pulled, ignoring the pain as the rough fibers bit into my skin. Just as I felt the ropes beginning to give, a deafening crack split the air. The cabin shuddered, and I looked up in horror to see a massive tree falling towards us, uprooted by the storm and the saturated ground. I redoubled my efforts, desperation lending me strength. The ropes fell away just as the tree struck the cabin. Timber splintered, and the roof began to cave in. I dove for the door, feeling debris rain down around me. I burst out into the storm, rain lashing at my face. Behind me, I heard an agonized scream as the cabin collapsed entirely. For a moment, I was tempted to go back, to try and help the man who had held me captive. But survival instinct took over, and I ran. I ran through the darkness, slipping and stumbling on the muddy ground. Lightning illuminated the forest in brief, terrifying flashes. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from that place as possible. I don't know how long I ran, or how far. Eventually, I collapsed at the base of a large tree, exhaustion and weeks of captivity finally catching up with me. As consciousness faded, I thought I heard voices, saw flashlight beams cutting through the rain. But surely that was just a hallucination, a final cruel trick of my beleaguered mind. I awoke in a hospital bed, surrounded by worried faces. Search and rescue had found me, I learned, after my family reported me missing. The storm that had facilitated my escape had also led to my salvation. The rescue teams had been checking the area for storm victims when they stumbled upon me. As I recovered, I told the authorities everything. They searched the area but found no trace of the cabin or the man who had held me captive. It was as if the woods had swallowed them whole, erasing all evidence of the nightmare I'd endured. Sometimes, in the dark of night, I still hear his voice. These woods take back, they take, and they keep. And I wonder, with a shiver, what other secrets those ancient forests might be hiding. The pit was a maw of darkness, its edges lined with sharpened wooden stakes. As I peered into its depths, the beam of my flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. A glint of white, unmistakably human bone. In that moment, I knew we had stumbled upon something far more sinister than anything we could have imagined on our weekend hiking trip. Little did I know, our discovery would plunge us into a nightmare that would test the limits of our survival instincts and our sanity. It was supposed to be a simple getaway. 4 friends, 3 days in the wilderness, miles away from the pressures of our everyday lives. Jake, our self-appointed leader, had found this secret trail online, promising breathtaking views and complete solitude. Sarah, always the cautious one, had expressed concerns about going off the beaten path, but Mark and I were too excited by the prospect of adventure to listen. The first day and a half were everything we'd hoped for. We hiked through pristine forests, marveled at hidden waterfalls, and spent the evening around a campfire, sharing stories and dreams under a canopy of stars. It felt like we were the only people in the world. It was on the second day that things took a turn. We had veered off Jake's mapped route, following what looked like a game trail in hopes of finding a good spot for photos. The forest seemed to grow denser, the light filtering through the canopy taking on an eerie, greenish tinge. An oppressive silence fell, broken only by the crunch of leaves under our boots. That's when we found it, the pit. At first, we thought it might be some kind of old hunting trap, but as we got closer, the scale of it became apparent. This was no animal snare. The pit was easily 15 feet across and so deep that the bottom was lost in shadow. "Guys, I really don't like this," Sarah whispered, voicing the fear we all felt. "We should go back." But curiosity got the better of us. Jake produced a length of rope from his pack, and before anyone could object, he had secured it to a nearby tree and was rappelling down into the pit. "Oh my God," his voice echoed up from the darkness. "You guys need to see this." One by one, we followed him down. The pit was deeper than it had looked from above, the walls lined with crude wooden scaffolding. And there, scattered across the earthen floor, were the remains. Not just bones, but personal effects. Tattered scraps of clothing, a rusted watch, even a child's toy. "What is this place?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. Before anyone could answer, a sound from above froze us in place. Voices, gruff and angry, were approaching the pit. We doused our lights, pressing ourselves against the damp walls. "I'm telling you, I heard something," one voice said. "Could be animals got into the pit again." "Better not be," another replied. "Boss'll have our heads if we lose any more merchandise." Merchandise. The word hung in the air, its implications chilling. This wasn't some archaeological site or the dumping ground of a lone killer. This was something far more organized, far more sinister. A beam of light cut through the darkness as someone peered into the pit. We held our breath, praying the shadows would conceal us. After what felt like an eternity, the light withdrew. "Nothing there," the first voice said. "Come on, let's finish the perimeter check." We waited until their footsteps faded before daring to breathe again. "We need to get out of here," Sarah hissed. "Now." No one argued. We scrambled up the rope, our movements fueled by pure adrenaline. As Jake, the last one up, pulled himself over the edge, a shout rang out. "Hey, stop right there!" We ran, crashing through the underbrush, hearts pounding. We fled deeper into the forest. Behind us, we could hear the sounds of pursuit, angry shouts and the crack of branches. "Split up," Jake yelled. "Meet back at the campsite." It was a terrible idea, but in our panic, it seemed like the only option. I veered left, plunging into a thicket of young trees. Branches whipped at my face. Thorns tore at my clothes. But I didn't slow down. The voices behind me grew fainter, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, hunted. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the green twilight of the dense forest. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for breath. As my panic subsided, the reality of my situation set in. I was alone, lost in an unfamiliar forest, being pursued by what I could only assume were very dangerous people. And my friends, where were they? Had they managed to escape, or... I couldn't finish the thought. I had to focus on survival, on finding my way back to the campsite. But as I tried to orient myself, I realized with growing horror that I had no idea which direction I had come from. The forest looked the same in every direction. An endless sea of green. Night was falling, the forest growing darker by the minute. I knew I should find shelter, but the thought of stopping, of making myself vulnerable, was terrifying. So I kept moving, picking a direction at random and hoping it would lead me to safety. The forest at night was a different world. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential pursuer. More than once, I froze at the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, certain I was about to be discovered. It was nearing dawn when I heard it. Voices again, but these were different. Familiar. Hope surged through me as I recognized Sarah's whispered tones. I moved towards the sound, trying to stay as quiet as possible. As I drew closer, I could make out more voices. Jake and Mark. They were alive. I burst into a small clearing, relief flooding through me at the sight of my friends. But that relief quickly turned to confusion, then horror. They weren't alone. A group of men, rough-looking and armed, stood around them. And there, in the center of it all, was Jake, talking animatedly with what appeared to be the leader. "I brought them, just like we agreed," Jake was saying. "Now, where's my money?" The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Jake, our friend, had led us into this trap deliberately. Before I could process what was happening, strong hands grabbed me from behind. I tried to struggle, to call out to Sarah and Mark, but a cloth was pressed over my mouth. As consciousness faded, the last thing I saw was Jake's face, a mixture of guilt and resolve in his eyes. I awoke in darkness, my head pounding. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was in some kind of cage, barely big enough to sit up in. Sarah and Mark were in similar cages nearby, both still unconscious. Over the next few days, or was it weeks, time lost all meaning in our underground prison. We learned the terrible truth. We had stumbled into the operations of a human trafficking ring, one that had been operating in these remote woods for years. Jake, deep in debt and desperate, had made a deal with them. Us, for his freedom. The days that followed were a nightmare of fear, pain, and desperate planning. We were moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to get our bearings. But slowly, carefully, we began to look for weaknesses in their operation, for any chance of escape. Our opportunity came during a transfer. One of our captors got careless, leaving a door unlocked. In a frenzy of desperation, we managed to overpower him and flee into the night. What followed was a harrowing chase through the forest, our pursuers always seeming just one step behind. We ran until our legs gave out, then forced ourselves to keep going. Finally, delirious with exhaustion and fear, we stumbled onto a highway. A passing trucker, seeing our condition, stopped and called for help. The authorities arrived in force, and the full extent of the trafficking operation was uncovered. Jake and the others were arrested, the victims rescued, but the scars of our ordeal ran deep. Even now, years later, I can't look at a forest without feeling a chill run down my spine. The rustling of leaves in the wind sounds too much like footsteps, the shadows between trees hiding potential threats. Our weekend adventure had turned into a nightmare that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. But we survived, and in that survival, we found a strength we never knew we had. The forest may have tried to keep us, but in the end, we proved stronger than its darkest secrets. The low rumble of engines pierced the stillness of the night, jolting me awake. My heart raced as I peered out of my tent, witnessing a scene that seemed ripped from a crime thriller. 3 unmarked vans, their headlights cutting through the darkness, unloading mysterious crates in a clearing not 50 yards from my campsite. In that moment, I realized my solo camping trip had unwittingly placed me in the crosshairs of something far more dangerous than any wild animal these woods could harbor. I'd come to this remote area seeking solitude and a break from the chaos of city life. As a freelance writer perpetually on deadline, the promise of a week alone in nature, away from Wi-Fi and cell service, had been irresistible. I'd spent the first 3 days hiking, taking photos, and reveling in the peaceful isolation. But now, on this moonless night, that isolation suddenly felt far more threatening than comforting. Holding my breath, I watched as shadowy figures efficiently unloaded crate after crate. Their movements were practiced, almost mechanical. This was clearly not their first time conducting whatever illicit business I was witnessing. I knew I should look away, should pretend I'd seen nothing and go back to sleep. But a morbid curiosity kept my eyes glued to the scene. One of the men, taller than the rest and carrying himself with an air of authority, barked out orders in a language I couldn't understand. The others responded immediately, their actions becoming even more focused and purposeful. Whatever was in those crates, it was valuable enough to warrant this level of secrecy and precision. Just as I was considering my options, stay hidden or try to sneak away, disaster struck. My water bottle, precariously balanced on my backpack, toppled over. The sound of it hitting the ground seemed deafening in the tense silence of the night. The activity in the clearing ceased instantly. I saw the tall man's head snap in my direction, his eyes scanning the darkness. Panic surged through me as I realized my tiny tent offered no real concealment or protection. "Check it out," I heard him growl, gesturing towards my campsite. My mind raced. I couldn't stay put. They'd find me in seconds. But running blindly into the dark forest seemed equally suicidal. In a split-second decision, I grabbed my emergency backpack, always packed and ready, a habit that suddenly seemed prescient, slipped out the back of my tent, and dove into the underbrush. I hadn't moved a moment too soon. As I pressed myself into the damp earth, I heard the sound of my tent being roughly searched. Angry voices called out to each other, and flashlight beams swept the area. I held my breath, certain that at any moment one of those beams would find me. But luck, it seemed, was on my side. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard the tall man shout something. The searchers withdrew, returning to the vans. Engines roared to life, and I watched through the leaves as the vehicle sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. I should have felt relief. Instead, a new wave of fear washed over me. They knew someone had seen them. They wouldn't just leave. This remote area was their territory, and they'd search every inch of it to find the witness. I knew I couldn't stay put. My best chance was to keep moving, to try and find my way back to civilization before they found me. But in the pitch darkness, with no trail to follow, that seemed like an impossible task. Still, I had no choice. I oriented myself as best I could using the stars and began to move. Every step was a challenge. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me. Branches clawed at my face and arms. More than once, I nearly fell, only catching myself at the last moment. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I allowed myself a moment of hope. I'd made it through the night. Surely, in the daylight, I could find my way to safety. That hope was short-lived. The sound of engines, distant but growing closer, sent a chill down my spine. They were searching methodically, using the roads that crisscross this wilderness. It was only a matter of time before they found me. I pushed on, my legs burning with exhaustion, my mind clouded with fear and lack of sleep. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just days ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential attacker. Midday found me stumbling across a small stream. I paused to refill my water bottle and splash some water on my face. As I straightened up, a glint of metal caught my eye. There, half hidden by moss and ferns, was an old cabin. My heart leapt. Shelter, and maybe supplies. I approached cautiously, aware that this could be a trap, but the cabin appeared long abandoned, its windows boarded up, its door hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Inside, a thick layer of dust covered everything. It was clear no one had been here in years. As I searched the cabin for anything useful, my foot caught on a loose floorboard. I stumbled, and as I caught myself, I noticed something odd. The floorboard had shifted, revealing a small space underneath. Curious, I pried it up further. What I found made my blood run cold. The hidden compartment was filled with papers, maps, schedules, lists of names and numbers. Even with my limited knowledge, I could see this was documentation of a massive smuggling operation. I had stumbled upon their record cache. The sound of an approaching vehicle snapped me back to reality. I shoved the papers into my backpack and ran to the window. An SUV was making its way down the overgrown road towards the cabin. They had found me. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I had to think. The cabin was a dead end. There was no way out except the front door, which would lead me straight to them. Unless... I looked up. The ceiling was low, but there was a small hatch leading to what I assumed was an attic space. It was risky. If they searched thoroughly, they'd find me for sure. But it was my only chance. I scrambled up, pulling the hatch closed behind me just as I heard the SUV pull up outside. The attic was stifling, filled with dust and cobwebs. I curled into the farthest corner, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. The door creaked open, footsteps entered, slow and deliberate. I could hear them searching, overturning furniture, opening cupboards. A voice called out, "Clear down here, boss." My heart nearly stopped. They were going to check the attic. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. But then, another voice. "Forget it. This place is a dead end. Let's move on." The footsteps retreated. The engine started up again. I remained frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe, until long after the sound of the SUV had faded away. As night fell again, I finally climbed down from my hiding place. I was exhausted, terrified, but alive, and I had evidence of their operation. If I could just make it back to civilization, I could bring this whole thing crashing down. The next day and a half were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and desperate hope. I pushed myself beyond what I thought I was capable of, driven by the need to survive and to expose what I had uncovered. When I finally stumbled onto a main road and flagged down a passing car, I nearly wept with relief. The elderly couple inside took one look at my battered, wild-eyed appearance and drove me straight to the police station. What followed was a whirlwind of statements, evidence processing, and arrests. The papers I had found were the key to dismantling a multi-state smuggling ring that had operated with impunity for years. As I finally returned home, days later, I found myself changed. The forest, once a place of peace and refuge, now held a darker aspect in my mind. But I also found a strength in myself I never knew I had. My solo camping trip had turned into something I never could have imagined. But in facing that danger, in surviving against the odds, I discovered a resilience that would stay with me for the rest of my life. The wilderness had tried to keep me, but in the end, I had proven stronger than its darkest secrets. The click of my camera shutter echoed across the mountain valley, freezing forever an image I was never meant to see. In that split second, I captured more than just the breathtaking landscape of the Rockies. I documented a crime that would turn my peaceful photography expedition into a desperate fight for survival. I've always been drawn to the raw beauty of nature, and as a wildlife photographer, I've ventured into some of the most remote corners of the world. But this trip to the Rocky Mountains was special. I'd heard rumors of a rare subspecies of mountain goat in a particularly isolated area, and the prospect of capturing it on film was irresistible. For days, I'd hiked deeper into the wilderness than I'd ever gone before. The terrain was challenging, but the views were spectacular. Jagged peaks pierced the sky, their snow-capped summits gleaming in the sunlight. Alpine meadows burst with wildflowers, and crystal-clear streams tumbled down rocky slopes. It was a photographer's paradise. On the fifth day, I reached a high ridge overlooking a secluded valley. As I set up my tripod and adjusted my telephoto lens, movement in the valley below caught my eye. At first, I thought it might be the elusive goats I'd been searching for. But as I peered through my viewfinder, my excitement turned to confusion, then to horror. There, in a clearing partially hidden by trees, was a makeshift mining operation. Heavy machinery scarred the pristine landscape, and a group of men moved purposefully around the site. This was no authorized excavation. The secretive nature of the operation and its remote location made that clear. I was witnessing illegal mining in a protected wilderness area. Without thinking, I started taking photos, documenting the scene. It wasn't until I heard a shout from below that I realized my mistake. One of the men had spotted me. Panic surged through me as I saw several of them pointing in my direction. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking as I tried to move as fast as possible. Just as I shouldered my backpack, I heard the unmistakable sound of an ATV engine roaring to life. I ran. The uneven terrain that had been a photographer's dream now became a nightmare obstacle course. I stumbled over rocks, slid on loose scree, and crashed through dense underbrush. The sound of the ATV grew louder, joined by others. They were coming after me, and they knew this territory far better than I did. My only advantage was that the steep, rocky slopes were difficult for the ATVs to navigate, but I knew they would find a way around, cutting me off if I didn't find somewhere to hide, and fast. As I crested a small rise, I spotted a narrow crevice in a nearby rock face. Without hesitation, I squeezed into it, pressing myself as far back as I could. The space was tight, the rough stones scraping my skin, but I didn't dare move. The ATVs roared past my hiding spot, their riders shouting to each other in a language I didn't understand. I held my breath, certain that at any moment they would discover me. But they continued on, the sound of their engines gradually fading into the distance. I waited until long after the last echoes had died away before I dared to move. As I emerged from the crevice, the full gravity of my situation hit me. I was alone in a vast wilderness, being hunted by dangerous men who wouldn't hesitate to silence a witness to their illegal activities. My planned route back to civilization was surely being watched. I had to find another way out. With shaking hands, I pulled out my map and compass. There was a ranger station marked about 20 miles to the east. It would mean crossing some of the most rugged terrain in the Rockies, but it was my only hope. I set off as the sun was setting, using the last of the daylight to put as much distance as possible between myself and the mining site. As darkness fell, the forest took on an eerie quality. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every sound a pursuer closing in. I walked through the night, too afraid to stop and rest. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by, but progress was agonizingly slow. More than once, I lost my footing on the treacherous terrain, each fall sending jolts of pain through my already exhausted body. Dawn found me high on an exposed ridgeline. In the early morning light, I could see for miles in every direction. The landscape was breathtaking, but I couldn't appreciate its beauty. My eyes scanned constantly for any sign of my pursuers. It was mid-morning when I heard it, the distant but unmistakable thrum of a helicopter. At first, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was search and rescue, coming to find me. But as the sound grew closer, I realized with sinking dread that it wasn't a rescue chopper. This was a sleek, black aircraft, moving in a deliberate search pattern. I dove for cover under a stunted pine, praying its branches would conceal me from aerial view. The helicopter passed overhead, so close I could feel the downdraft from its rotors. It circled the area twice before moving on, but I knew it would be back. They were searching methodically, and it was only a matter of time before they found me. Desperation lent me strength as I pushed on. I rationed my meager supplies, knowing I had to make them last. The water from icy mountain streams quenched my thirst, but did little to ease the gnawing hunger in my stomach. As the day wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. My steps became unsteady, my thinking foggy. More than once, I caught myself walking in circles, my tired mind unable to maintain a straight course, but the fear of capture drove me forward. It was late afternoon when disaster struck. As I was picking my way down a steep, rocky slope, my foot slipped. I fell hard, tumbling down the incline in a shower of loose stones. Pain exploded in my ankle as I came to a stop, and I knew immediately it was badly sprained, if not broken. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I couldn't walk, couldn't run. I was a sitting duck for my pursuers. As if to emphasize my predicament, I heard the helicopter returning, its sound growing louder by the second. In desperation, I crawled under an overhanging rock, pulling branches and debris over myself for camouflage. I lay there, hardly daring to breathe, as the helicopter circled overhead. The pain in my ankle was excruciating, but I didn't dare move to examine it. Hours passed. The helicopter came and went several times, but I remained hidden. As night fell again, I realized I had to move. Injury or not, staying in one place was too dangerous. I fashioned a crude splint for my ankle using branches and strips torn from my shirt. Every movement was agony, but I gritted my teeth and pressed on. I moved slowly, painfully, using my tripod as a makeshift crutch. The next day passed in a haze of pain and fear. I was running on pure adrenaline, pushing my body far beyond its limits. But as the sun began to set, I saw something that made my heart leap. A thin column of smoke rising in the distance. The ranger station. New energy flooded through me. I was close, so close to safety. But as I limped toward my salvation, a sound behind me made my blood run cold. Voices. My pursuers had found my trail. The final half-mile to the ranger station was the most terrifying of my life. I could hear them getting closer, their shouts carrying clearly in the mountain air. My injured ankle screamed in protest with every step, but I pushed through the pain, driven by sheer desperation. I burst out of the tree line into the clearing around the ranger station, screaming for help. The door flew open, a startled-looking ranger emerging with his hand on his sidearm. Behind me, I heard my pursuers crash out of the woods, then stop short at the sight of the ranger. What followed was a blur of questions, medical treatment, and police statements. The evidence I had captured led to a major investigation, uncovering a network of illegal mining operations throughout the Rockies. As I finally left the mountains, My body battered, but my spirit unbroken. I knew I would never see the wilderness the same way again. The raw beauty that had drawn me in now held a darker edge, a reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most pristine places. But I also discovered a strength in myself I never knew I possessed. The ordeal had pushed me to my absolute limits, and I had survived. As I looked back at those majestic peaks, I felt a mix of fear, respect, and a deep, unshakable awe. The mountains had nearly killed me, but they had also revealed the true depths of my resilience, and that, I realized, was the most valuable discovery of all. The first punch caught me off guard, a meaty fist connecting with my jaw and sending me sprawling onto the dusty street. As I tasted blood, I realized with sickening clarity that this quaint little town in the Adirondacks wasn't the idyllic hiking destination I'd imagined. It was a trap, and I had walked right into it. I'd always been an avid hiker, seeking out remote trails and off-the-beaten-path destinations. When I stumbled across an online forum post about a picturesque town nestled deep in the Adirondack Mountains, it seemed like the perfect getaway. The post raved about the town's untouched beauty, its friendly locals, and the pristine hiking trails surrounding it. It was exactly what I needed after months of grinding away at my desk job in the city. The journey to reach the town was an adventure in itself. The winding mountain roads became progressively narrower and less maintained as I drove deeper into the wilderness. My GPS lost signal hours ago, leaving me to navigate by the crude hand-drawn map I'd copied from the forum post. As I rounded a final bend, the town came into view. It was like stepping back in time. Weathered wooden buildings lined the main street, their paint peeling and faded. A few old pickup trucks were parked haphazardly along the road, but there wasn't a soul in sight. I parked my car and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. For a moment, I stood there breathing it in, feeling the tension of city life start to melt away. That's when I noticed him, a burly man in a flannel shirt, watching me from the porch of what looked like a general store. His gaze was intense and unfriendly. I raised a hand in greeting, trying to shake off the sudden unease that gripped me. "Afternoon," I called out. "Beautiful town you have here." He didn't respond, just continued to stare. Deciding to ignore the awkward encounter, I grabbed my backpack from the car and started towards what I assumed was the town's only inn. I didn't make it 3 steps before I heard his gruff voice behind me. "We don't like strangers here." I turned, forcing a smile. "I'm just passing through, looking to do some hiking. I'll be gone in a few days." That's when he threw the punch that started it all. As I lay on the ground, dazed and tasting blood, more men emerged from the surrounding buildings. They formed a loose circle around me, their faces a uniform mask of hostility. "You shouldn't have come here," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. "This ain't a place for tourists." I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding. I'll leave right now, no harm done." I turned towards my car, but 2 of the men had already positioned themselves between me and my only means of escape. "Oh, you'll leave all right," the first man said, cracking his knuckles. "But not before we teach you a lesson about trespassing." What followed was a nightmare of fists and boots. I fought back as best I could, but I was hopelessly outnumbered. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard the distinctive sound of a shotgun being cocked. "That's enough, boys," a new voice called out. The beating stopped, and I looked up to see an older man holding a shotgun, his weathered face set in a grim expression. "Get him up." Rough hands hauled me to my feet. The older man, clearly some kind of authority figure, looked me up and down. "You've got 2 choices, stranger. You can turn around and drive out of here right now, or you can spend the night in our jail while we decide what to do with you." My whole body ached, and I could feel blood trickling from a cut above my eye. but the thought of being locked up in this hostile town terrified me even more than the beating. "I'll leave," I managed to croak out. The old man nodded. "Smart choice. But know this, if you ever come back, if you ever tell anyone about this place, we'll know. And next time, we won't be so gentle." They marched me to my car, watching as I fumbled with the keys. As I started the engine, the old man leaned in through the window. "One more thing," he said, his voice low. "That map you used to find us, destroy it, for your own good." I didn't need to be told twice. I peeled out of there, gravel spraying as I accelerated down the mountain road. In my rearview mirror, I could see the men watching until I rounded a bend, and the town disappeared from view. My mind raced as I drove, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why were they so hostile to outsiders? What were they hiding? Part of me wanted to go to the police, to report the assault, but a deeper, more primal part of me knew that would be a mistake. These people had made it clear they had ways of knowing things, and I didn't doubt their threats. As the adrenaline wore off, the pain from my injuries set in. I needed medical attention, but I was afraid to stop in any of the small towns I passed. What if they were connected to the place I'd just fled? It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Albany, hours later, that I finally felt safe enough to seek help. The emergency room staff were concerned, asking questions about my injuries that I deflected with a story about a hiking accident. They patched me up, but the deeper wounds, the fear, the confusion, the sense of violation, those would take much longer to heal. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the experience. I scoured the internet for any information about the town, but it was like it didn't exist. The forum where I'd found the original post had been taken down. The hand-drawn map, which I'd left in my car, had vanished. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that at any moment those men from the town would show up to silence me permanently. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep at night. The bruises faded, but the mental scars remained raw. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the intensity of the fear began to fade, replaced by a gnawing curiosity. What was that town? Why were they so determined to remain hidden? The questions consumed me. Against my better judgment, I began to dig deeper. I pored over old maps of the Adirondacks, trying to pinpoint the town's location. I reached out to hiking groups, carefully probing for any information about off-the-grid communities in the area. Most of my inquiries led nowhere, but occasionally I'd catch a whisper, a hint that maybe I wasn't crazy, that there really was something out there. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I heard a noise outside my apartment. A car door slamming, footsteps on the stairs. My heart raced as I remembered the old man's warning. "If you ever tell anyone about this place, we'll know." I fled that night, throwing some clothes and my laptop into a bag and driving until I ran out of gas. I've been on the move ever since, never staying in one place for too long, always looking over my shoulder. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it would have been better to have spent that night in their jail, to have learned the truth about that town and its secrets. But then I remember the cold fury in their eyes, the casual violence with which they greeted a stranger, and I know I made the right choice. I still hike, still seek out remote trails and hidden vistas. But now I do it with a wary eye, always alert for signs that I might be stumbling into another trap. The wilderness, once a source of peace and renewal, now holds a darker edge in my mind. And sometimes, when the wind whispers through the trees just right, I swear I can hear their voices, a grim reminder that some secrets are meant to stay buried in the mountains, and some towns don't want to be found. The experience changed me, made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. There are places out there, hidden in plain sight, that operate by their own rules. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is to accidentally discover them. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened in that town, or why they were so determined to remain isolated. But I do know this. The next time I plan a hiking trip, I'll stick to the well-traveled paths. Because sometimes, the road less taken leads to places you might not come back from. The glint of metal in the moonlight was my first warning that this was no ordinary camping trip. As I squinted into the darkness, my blood ran cold at the sight of the gun barrel pointed directly at my face. In that moment, I realized our peaceful family getaway in the redwoods had just become a fight for survival against a group of men whose intentions were anything but friendly. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend. My wife, Sarah, and I had been planning this camping trip with our 2 kids, Emma, 10, and Jack, 8, for months. We both had high-stress jobs in the city, and the idea of unplugging for a few days in the majestic redwood forests of Northern California seemed like the perfect way to reconnect as a family. The first day had been idyllic. We'd hiked through groves of ancient trees, their massive trunks stretching impossibly high into the sky. The kids had marveled at banana slugs and collected pine cones bigger than their heads. As night fell, we'd roasted marshmallows over the campfire, sharing stories and gazing up at stars brighter than any we could see back home. It was well past midnight when I was jolted awake by the sound of engines, loud, rumbling engines that had no place in this secluded campground. I unzipped the tent flap and peered out, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. 3 pickup trucks had pulled into the clearing, their headlights cutting harsh swaths through the misty air. As I watched, a group of men climbed out, rough-looking characters who moved with a sense of purpose that sent a chill down my spine. I ducked back into the tent, my mind racing. "Sarah," I whispered urgently, shaking her awake. "We need to go. Now." She blinked at me groggily, confusion turning to fear as she registered the tension in my voice. "What's going on?" "There are men outside," I said, already moving to wake the kids. "Something's not right. We need to leave." But before we could even begin to gather our things, a harsh voice cut through the night. "Come on out, folks. We know you're in there." My heart pounding, I exchanged a terrified glance with Sarah. There was no way out. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my hands raised. 5 men stood before us, backlit by the truck's headlights. Their leader, a tall man with a wild beard, stepped forward. The moonlight glinted off the gun in his hand. The same gun now pointed directly at me. Well, he drawled, a mirthless grin spreading across his face. "Looks like we've got ourselves some city folk enjoying our woods." Sarah emerged from the tent behind me, pulling Emma and Jack close. I could feel them trembling, and it took every ounce of willpower not to show my own fear. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We don't want any trouble. We're just camping with our kids. Take whatever you want and we'll leave." The man's grin widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Oh, I don't think so. See, these here woods, they're ours, and we don't take kindly to outsiders." One of the other men spoke up, his voice thick with malice. "Maybe we ought to teach them a lesson, Jed. Show them what happens to folks who don't respect our territory." Jed considered this for a moment, his eyes never leaving mine. "Now that's not a bad idea, Clyde. But first, let's see what kind of supplies our city friends brought us." They ransacked our campsite, helping themselves to our food and gear. I stood there helplessly, acutely aware of the gun still trained on us. Sarah hugged the kids close, murmuring reassurances even as tears streamed down her face. As they finished looting our supplies, Jed turned back to us. "All right, here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna come with us for a little camping trip of our own, and if you behave, maybe we'll let you go when we're done." The implications of his words sent a wave of terror through me. I knew we couldn't let them take us. Whatever they had planned, it wouldn't end well for us. In that moment, as I looked at my terrified family, something snapped inside me. A primal, protective instinct took over. I had to get us out of this, no matter the cost. "Okay," I said, forcing a note of defeat into my voice. "Just, please don't hurt my family." Jed smirked, clearly enjoying his power over us. "That's up to you, city boy. Now move." As they herded us towards the trucks, I squeezed Sarah's hand, trying to convey a silent message. She met my eyes, and I saw understanding flash across her face. We'd been together long enough to communicate without words. Just as we reached the vehicles, I stumbled, falling to my knees. "Sorry," I mumbled. "Just give me a second." As Jed stepped closer, annoyed at the delay, I exploded into action. I drove my shoulder into his midsection, sending us both crashing to the ground. The gun went off, the shot going wide, but the sound galvanized everyone into motion. "Run!" I shouted to Sarah and the kids, grappling with Jed for control of the weapon. Sarah didn't hesitate. She scooped up Jack and grabbed Emma's hand, sprinting for the cover of the trees. The other men, momentarily stunned by the sudden turn of events, were slow to react. I managed to wrench the gun from Jed's grasp and scrambled to my feet. Without thinking, I fired 2 shots into the air. The loud reports echoed through the forest, startling the men into inaction for a crucial few seconds. I took off after my family, my lungs burning as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit, but the dense underbrush and the darkness worked in our favor, making it difficult for them to follow. We ran for what felt like hours, the sounds of our pursuers sometimes fading, sometimes growing alarmingly close. The kids were exhausted, and I found myself carrying Jack while Sarah supported a stumbling Emma. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, we broke through the tree line onto a road. Headlights approached, and I felt a moment of panic. Was it them? But as the vehicle drew closer, I saw it was a park ranger's truck. The ranger, a middle-aged woman, took in our disheveled, terrified appearance with wide eyes. "What on earth happened to you folks?" Between gasping breaths, we managed to explain the situation. She immediately radioed for backup, then ushered us into her vehicle. As we drove away, lights flashing, I held my family close. We were safe, but the ordeal had left deep scars. The peaceful forest that had promised renewal now held only terror and the memory of that nightmarish encounter. In the days that followed, as we gave statements to the police and tried to process what had happened, I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions. Relief at our escape, certainly, but also a deep-seated anger at the men who had shattered our sense of safety, and a gnawing fear that never quite went away. The authorities eventually caught most of the group, but Jed and one other managed to evade capture. Knowing they were still out there somewhere made it hard to feel truly safe, even back in the city. It took months of therapy and support for all of us to start healing. The kids had nightmares, and Sarah and I found ourselves jumping at every unexpected sound. But slowly, we began to reclaim our lives. One day, about a year after the incident, Emma asked if we could go camping again. My initial reaction was fear, but as I looked at the hopeful faces of my family, I realized something important. Those men had taken enough from us, our sense of security, our innocence about the world. I couldn't let them take our love for nature too. So we went camping again, this time in a busy, well-patrolled campground. It wasn't the secluded wilderness experience we'd once sought, but as I watched my kids laugh and play under the trees, I felt a knot inside me begin to loosen. The redwoods had been the site of our greatest terror, but they were also teaching us our greatest lesson, that with love, support, and courage, we could overcome even the darkest of experiences. The forest that had once been a place of fear was becoming, once again, a place of healing and renewal. As I sit here now, years later, I can look back on that night with a sense of perspective. Yes, it was terrifying. Yes, it changed us. But it also showed us the strength we had as a family, the depth of our love for each other, and our capacity to heal and grow. The redwoods still stand, ancient and indifferent to the dramas that play out beneath their branches, and we still visit them, older now, wiser, but no longer afraid. Because we learned that the most important thing isn't the dangers we might face, but the strength we find in facing them together. The first sip of water tasted off, a subtle wrongness that I initially dismissed as trail fatigue. It wasn't until the dizziness hit, my vision blurring at the edges, that I realized with horrifying clarity someone had poisoned my water supply. In that moment, as nausea surged through me, I knew my solitary camping trip in the national park had just become a desperate fight for survival. I'd come to these woods seeking peace, a chance to clear my head after months of grueling work and personal setbacks. The promise of pristine wilderness, far from cell signals and the constant ping of notifications, had been irresistible. Now, as I stumbled to my knees, that isolation became my greatest threat. The first day had been everything I'd hoped for. I'd hiked miles into the backcountry, setting up camp near a crystal-clear stream. The air was crisp with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. As night fell, I'd sat by my small campfire, feeling the tension of the past months slowly melting away. It was mid-morning on the second day when I first noticed something was wrong. I'd been out exploring, taking photos of the landscape, when I returned to find my campsite different. Nothing major, just small things out of place. My sleeping bag was slightly unzipped, my cooking gear rearranged. At first I thought maybe an animal had wandered through, but there were no tracks, no signs of foraging. An uneasy feeling settled in my gut, but I pushed it aside. I was miles from anywhere, in a rarely visited part of the park. It had to be my imagination playing tricks on me. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the solitude was getting to me. But part of me knew something was very, very wrong. It was late afternoon when I took that fateful drink. I'd been rationing my water, planning to refill my bottles at the stream in the morning. The water tasted slightly bitter, but I was thirsty enough that I didn't think much of it at first. Within minutes, the world began to spin. I collapsed onto the forest floor, my stomach churning, my limbs feeling like lead. As darkness crept into the edges of my vision, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure emerging from the trees. Panic surged through me, momentarily overriding the effects of whatever I'd been drugged with. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I forced myself to my feet and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, heavy footsteps and the crack of breaking branches. My vision swam, and more than once I nearly fell, but terror kept me upright and moving. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to get away, to find help, or a place to hide until the drug wore off. But with each passing minute, I could feel my strength ebbing. Whatever I'd been given was powerful, and I knew I couldn't outrun its effects forever. Just as my legs were about to give out, I saw it. A small cave entrance, half hidden behind a curtain of vines. With the last of my energy, I dove inside, crawling as far back as I could before collapsing. The cave was dark and damp, the air thick with the musty scent of decay. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw that it extended further back, narrowing into a tight passage. Part of me wanted to keep going, to put as much distance between myself and my pursuer as possible, but my body had other ideas. The drug was taking full effect now, and I could barely move. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. Time lost all meaning in the darkness of the cave. Sometimes I thought I heard voices outside, but I couldn't be sure if they were real or just fever dreams brought on by the poison. When I finally came to, weak and disoriented but alive, sunlight was filtering through the cave entrance. How many hours had passed? A day? More? My mouth was painfully dry, my stomach empty and aching. Cautiously, I crawled to the cave entrance and peered out. The forest seemed peaceful, no sign of my mysterious attacker. But I knew I couldn't trust appearances. Whoever had poisoned me was still out there, probably searching for me. I took stock of my situation. I had no water, My bottles were back at the campsite, and I didn't dare drink from them anyway. No food, no supplies beyond what was in my pockets, and I was lost, having run blindly into unfamiliar territory in my drugged state. But I was alive, and that meant I had a chance. I just had to find my way back to civilization before dehydration, starvation, or my unknown assailant caught up with me. Moving as quietly as I could, I left the safety of the cave. Every sense was on high alert, scanning for any sign of danger. I picked a direction that I hoped would lead me to lower ground, reasoning that it might eventually lead to a river or stream. The going was slow. My body was weak from the poison and lack of food, and every sound made me freeze, certain I was about to be discovered. More than once, I had to duck for cover as I heard voices in the distance. Whether they belonged to my attacker or innocent hikers, I couldn't risk finding out. As the day wore on, thirst became my most pressing concern. My tongue felt swollen in my mouth, and my head pounded with every step. I knew that without water, I wouldn't last much longer. Just as despair was starting to set in, I heard it, the faint sound of running water. New energy flooded through me, and I pushed forward with renewed determination. The sound grew louder, and finally, I broke through the trees to find a small, swift-running stream. I wanted nothing more than to plunge my face into the cool water and drink my fill. But the memory of that bitter taste, of the disorientation and fear that followed, held me back. Instead, I cupped my hands and brought them to my nose, sniffing carefully. The water seemed clean, with no unusual odor. Taking a deep breath, I allowed myself a small sip. I held it in my mouth, rolling it around, searching for any hint of that bitter taste. Finding none, I swallowed, then waited tensely for several minutes. When no ill effects appeared, I drank deeply, feeling life flow back into my parched body. With my most immediate need addressed, I turned my attention to finding food and, more importantly, a way out of this nightmare. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead to a larger river and eventually to civilization. As I walked, I foraged what I could: wild berries, edible plants I recognized from wilderness survival books I'd read. It wasn't much, but it gave me the energy to keep moving. The day passed, then another. I lost track of time, focused solely on putting one foot in front of the other. My clothes were torn, my body covered in scratches and bruises, but I was alive and I was moving, and that was all that mattered. On what I think was the fourth day since my escape, I heard a sound that made my heart leap, the distant whop 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 of helicopter blades. I ran towards the sound, waving my arms frantically and shouting at the top of my lungs. The helicopter passed overhead once, then circled back. I saw a figure lean out, spotting me. Minutes later, I was being winched up, away from the forest that had nearly claimed my life. The aftermath was a blur of hospital rooms, police interviews, and worried family members. The authorities searched the area where I'd been camping but found no trace of my attacker. My poisoned water bottles had vanished, leaving no evidence of the attempt on my life. In the months that followed, as I tried to piece my life back together, I grappled with the question that haunted me. Why? Why had someone tried to kill me? Was I a random target, or had I been specifically chosen? The not knowing was almost worse than the ordeal itself. Slowly, I began to heal, both physically and mentally. But the experience left its mark. I still love nature, still feel drawn to wild places. But now I go with open eyes, aware that the greatest dangers in the wilderness aren't always the ones with claws and fangs. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom taste of bitter water on my tongue. In those moments, I remind myself that I survived, that whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and that sometimes the most important survival skill is the will to live, to fight against the darkness and find our way back to the light. The wilderness tried to keep me, tried to make me another mysterious disappearance in the vast expanse of the national park. But I made it out, and in doing so, I discovered a strength within myself that I never knew existed, a strength that would carry me through whatever challenges life might throw at me next.